Good morning, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to day 2 of the 4th Southeast Asia Multi-Sectoral Multi-Stakeholder Forum for SDGs. And for those who are joining again this morning, welcome back to the forum. So we will continue our deliberation on the progress of the SDGs in Southeast Asia in the context of COVID-19. Day 1, we were updated on the impact of the pandemic with regards to member states' efforts on the progress of achieving the SDGs. Today, we will listen to the other components of how some of the important component sectors and also issues that are affecting countries with regards to their achieving the SDGs. For this morning's session, we will deliberate on the importance of the finance or financing sector with respect to the COVID-19 Southeast Asia recovery. Moderating today's session is Dr. Tintip Subanish, who is the Chief Financing for Development section of SCAP. She will be presiding over the opening remarks from the ASEAN Secretariat, as well as the keynote speaker from Dr. Zeti. With that, may I give the floor to Dr. Tintip. You have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are. So, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all of you, and for joining this session of the 4th Southeast Asia Multi-Stakeholder Forum on the implementation of Sustainable Development Goals that SCAP is organizing today. I am Tintip Subanish. I am Chief of Financing for Development here at SCAP. I'll be your moderator today to facilitate the discussion on understanding the importance of financing in the context of COVID-19, Southeast Asia recovery, and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. So at the start, I just would like to frame the discussion today in this session. The discussion basically will evolve around 3 broad issues. First is that countries in Southeast Asia would need to continue the current expansionary policy to ensure the recovery is sustained over a sustained period of time. At the same time, they need to invest substantial amount to support the SDGs. So how do we, as countries, government, reconcile the need for further spending and investment with the need to ensure economic sustainability? The second point is that amid this period of heightened uncertainty, how can we prioritize policies that are most urgently needed and can be implemented to build back better the Southeast Asian economies? And last is that, and most important probably, is how can regional cooperation in finance contribute to the process of a recovery plan, and how can international organizations such as UNSCAP, ASEAN Secretariat, and important partners here today to work towards its formulation and implementation. So I really look forward to a fruitful discussion and important conversation today. Before we start the panel discussion, we have the honor of several guest speakers today. I would like to first kindly ask distinguished speakers to keep your video on while muted the microphone when you are not speaking. For participants in the MS Team platform, we kindly ask you to turn off the video and mute your microphone. So without further ado, and to start this exciting discussion, I would like to invite Dr. Aladdin Rillo, Deputy Secretary General for the ASEAN Economic Community of ASEAN Secretariat, to deliver his opening remarks. Dear Aladdin, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tintit, and thank you for the kind introduction, and a very good morning to all. It is indeed my pleasure to be part of this forum on multi-sector forum on the implementation of SDGs. Let me also take this opportunity to thank ESCAP, Mr. Ron and Dr. Tintit for organizing this forum and also for inviting me to open this particular session. I think looking at the current situation, like other regions in the world, ASEAN region is also in a very precarious situation. 8 months into this pandemic crisis, ASEAN region actually continues to face a lot of uncertainties and challenges. And despite the fact that there are a number of measures being implemented to overcome this pandemic, and most of them are actually very decisive, the uncertainty surrounding this pandemic continues to evolve. And I think that also makes the strength of recovery in the region, as we look at it, also very uncertain. But I think despite that, ASEAN as a region is very much committed to emerge strong and resilient from this crisis. In fact, we look at this crisis, or this particular crisis, as actually not only exposed the vulnerabilities of the region, but it has also provided some opportunity for the region to examine a number of development challenges in the region and to be able to address them better and also to give back better. Looking at the current situation, I think one of the most important challenges in the region right now is the issue of sustainability. Although sustainability agenda in ASEAN is actually well entrenched into our community building efforts, particularly in the ASEAN Community Vision 2025, which is also in line with the 2030 UN Development Agenda. I think the need to intensify our efforts in the region to address sustainability in all dimensions has become more urgent during this pandemic. We actually recognize that ASEAN should not only become an integrated region, but more importantly, the development path in the region should remain inclusive, sustainable, and resilient all the time. That's why when we look at our recovery efforts, one integral part of our recovery efforts under the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework is the need to build resilience within the region. And the way we look at resilience in the region is to be able to address sustainability in the region across different dimensions, and by implementing a number of initiatives that support sustainability within the region. These initiatives, for example, under the recovery framework of ASEAN would include areas such as sustainable investment, clean and renewable energy. We're also looking at sustainable agriculture, as well as green infrastructure. In all these initiatives, you also make sure that we incorporate the ability to also look at financing to be also green as well, by making sure that we're able to strengthen the public financing within the region, and at the same time being able to mobilize a number of innovative financing mechanisms that would support sustainable financing in the region. For example, under the ASEAN Recovery Framework, one of the ways by which we try to achieve sustainable finance during this COVID-19 is to make use of these different instruments. For example, the use of sustainability bonds as well as social bonds, which are also intended to support or finance activities that provide positive social impacts in the region, and would also enable countries in the region to mitigate the pandemic and to be prepared for future pandemics or emergencies. However, it doesn't say that even without this pandemic, actually, sustainable finance has become an important priority for ASEAN over the years. For example, under the ASEAN cooperation in finance, there's a lot of discussion right now on trying to incorporate sustainable finance into different subsectors within the region's financial system. Last month, our ministers of finance, as well as the central bank governors of finance, have further reaffirmed their commitment to intensify efforts towards sustainable financing in the region by making sure that the different initiatives in the region are actually working and are also in line with the overall objectives of the ASEAN economic community. So let me try to mention some of these initiatives right now in ASEAN to support sustainable finance. In the area of capital markets, we have now in the region an existing roadmap on ASEAN sustainable capital market. The roadmap actually consists of around 15 concrete recommendations on how to support and develop sustainable capital markets in the region across 4 priority areas. The region has also adopted the ASEAN Green Bond Standards, and work is also underway to be able to develop ASEAN standards on sustainability bans as well as social bans, which again will help us address issues on how this financing related to these bans would prepare the region into dealing with future pandemics. In the area of banking, work is also underway in the region to develop the ASEAN sustainable banking principles that would really serve as guide for policymakers in the region to be able to develop policies and regulations that would ensure the sustainability of banking in ASEAN. The plan is to have these sustainability banking principles to be developed by next year, similar to the 2 initiatives on sustainability bonds as well as social bonds that we try to also implement by next year. In the area of the insurance markets, our insurance market regulators have actually increasingly recognized the need to incorporate sustainability as well as green initiatives into their respective insurance markets. In fact, they had a meeting just 2 days ago, and during that meeting, the ASEAN regulators again reaffirmed their commitment to initiate further discussion on how to promote sustainable insurance financing in the region. I think all of these initiatives again suggest how the region is looking at sustainable financing in the region as a way forward to be able to support our community building efforts. But despite its importance, however, sustainable financing in the region is still an area that needs to be further strengthened and developed. That's why I'm very happy that our session today is focusing on that issue of financing, particularly on how we can develop more policies and regulations that would allow the region to undertake activities that support sustainability in the region across different dimensions. For example, I think the issue of financing, in my view, is very, very important during this current situation of COVID-19 pandemic. Because as I mentioned before in our recovery efforts, we put a lot of emphasis on how we can implement a number of initiatives that support sustainability and ensure resilient recovery for the region in the coming years. For example, we're looking at how we can further strengthen sustainable investment in renewable energy, in agriculture, in different areas. And in my view, it is very important to have available financing ready to make sure that the region is also capable to be able to implement these different sustainability initiatives to support our objective of having a resilient recovery in the coming years. Before I end my speech, let me just talk a little bit about the different ways by which sustainable financing in the region can be further achieved. In my view, the way to achieve financial sustainability in the region, sustainable financing, is actually both an economic and ethical imperative. I think we need to make sure that the private sector, for example, are really with us together in ensuring that we all work together in promoting sustainable finance. There are different ways to do that. One is through a strong public financing. I think we need to recognize that to be able to support sustainable financing, we also have to make sure that we have a strong fiscal consolidation in place, as well as a strong medium-term fiscal framework that would enable countries in the region to generate a significant amount of revenues, as well as to make sure that the spending is also within the levels of efficiency that would allow countries in the region to support sustainable finance. Secondly, I think we need to also engage proactively with the private sector in the development of innovative financing mechanisms that would allow, again, significant investment on sustainable areas. And at the same time, to encourage the private sector to focus more on long-term development goals instead of just looking at profits. I think for me, that's very important. As I mentioned earlier, I think some instruments in the region are already there that would support that, including, for example, the use of sustainability bans as well as social bans, as well as the use of hybrid finance that would mitigate risk in the region and at the same time encourage more private investment in the region. Finally, I always look at sustainable financing or financing in general as a global and regional public good. As such, I think to be able to achieve these goals, it is very important that we have a very strong regional cooperation in place. We have to make sure that there is a strong also partnership, that there's a strong common sense of being able to support sustainable financing in the region. And I think this is very important in the current situation. I look at sustainable financing as not only a lip service, but it is for me a strong commitment that all countries in the region should be able to pursue. So in closing, let me just again reiterate that during this COVID-19 pandemic, ASEAN remains committed to emerge strong and resilient. But we also recognize that the path to a resilient and inclusive recovery is not only a responsibility by governments alone. We have to make sure that everybody in the region are able to contribute to that process. I think the same can be applied about the issue of sustainable financing or financing in general. To be able to address this particular issue, we have to make sure that the different stakeholders in the region are available to support that initiative. Particularly, we have to look at the role of the governments, international organizations like ESCAP, the role of the private sector, as well as individuals, to make sure that everybody would pitch in to support this idea of sustainable financing. For me, to be able to achieve sustainable financing is not only a partnership for all, but more than that, I think it is also a joint responsibility by everyone to make sure that financing is available to undertake different activities and to ensure that the goals of SDGs and sustainability in ASEAN and other regions in the world are being achieved. With those words, again, let me then say thank you so much for allowing me to speak with you today. And I really look forward to to listening to your inputs as well. Again, thank you so much and good morning.
Thank you very much, DSG Aladdin Rilo, for these very inspiring opening remarks, and very glad to hear a strong commitment from ASEAN Secretariat towards sustainable finance and your willingness to cooperate with international organizations and others to achieve sustainable development goals in this difficult time. So with that, I would like to now a pleasure to give the floor to our next speaker, Dr. Seti Akhtar Aziz, Chairman of Pemodelan Nasional Berhad and former Governor of Bank Negara Malaysia, to deliver her keynote speech, basically to set the right priorities in financing sustainable recovery from the COVID-19 and to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Dr. Seti, the floor is yours. And Dr. Seti, may I now invite you to give your keynote speech, please. Perhaps you should unmute your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very clear, but cannot see you still.
Oh. Can you see me now?
Yes, yes, thank you very much. Please.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes, distinguished persons from ASCAP and panel speakers. It's my honor to participate in this session on the role of financing, which has been key for the economic recovery from this pandemic. health pandemic in the world economies. It will also be integral in achieving the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The management of the recovery can be discussed in three parts. The first being containing the spread of the pandemic, and for some parts of the world, it has gone on longer than anticipated, and it has required massive resources to be accorded for the social infrastructure, in particular, the health systems, and for the capability, for example, of testing and contact tracing. So the health infrastructure has particularly been important. Most of Asia has done relatively better, having had the experience of dealing with previous pandemics and having built the foundations after every crisis that we have experienced. Efforts are also being given to avoid its resurgence. The second aspect is managing the economic consequences of the pandemic, which has been devastating on most economies. In varying degrees, most will experience a massive economic contraction and higher unemployment and rising inequalities. The policy response has been prompt and massive to keep economies functioning. Fiscal stimulus have ranged up to 20% of GDP, and this has required huge financing requirements. The third concerns managing the aftermath of the pandemic and not losing the line of sight of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in the post-pandemic period. This will require investments for the future. The post-pandemic period is not going to be the same, with fundamental shifts that are already affecting the manner in which the economy is functioning. Again, this will demand for massive financing requirements. While in the immediate period, the stimulus that has been implemented has been vital to promote demand and to keep the economy going, such a consumption and debt-driven economy is not sustainable. There is a need for investment-led growth that is supported by a technology-led transformation. In addition to physical infrastructure to support growth and development, also needed are investments in the IT infrastructure and digitalization for greater efficiency, outreach, and security to thereby support future growth. Priority also needs to be given to social infrastructure to provide the capacity and capability to support future growth. And this would include, as I've mentioned earlier, healthcare infrastructure. And also, in addition to this, and equally important, is the education infrastructure, amongst others. Financing has been key to the economic recovery currently taking place. The monetary and financial measures implemented thus far have included the provision of liquidity, lowering rates to historical levels to reduce costs of financing, the creation of special funds, providing credit guarantees, according moratoriums to borrowers, and instituting mechanisms for debt restructuring. This has been reinforced by fiscal stimulus that have provided relief in terms of unemployment benefits, cash transfers, subsidies, tax reliefs, and grants to businesses are amongst some of the measures. The ability of many parts of Asia to rise up to this challenge, to be well positioned to provide financing requirements thus far, has been from the payoffs, from the lessons from the Asian financial crisis. The financial reforms that were implemented in this recent decade since has been reinforced by the development of the financial sector and the greater regional financial integration. I would like to mention a few of these. Amongst the efforts that were taken was financial institutions were significantly strengthened. Financial markets were developed, and this has been mentioned, in particular the bond markets. This is one of the fundamental areas that have enhanced resilience for having a more diverse, from being bank concentrated to having the risk dispersed in the financial system. Then financial reforms involve deregulation and liberalization to generate a more competitive financial system. Surveillance was strengthened. Additionally, regulatory and supervisory oversight became more robust and rigorous. There was greater transparency and disclosure was instituted. Greater flexibility in the exchange rate regimes were adopted, and then financial safety nets were instituted. These have been very valuable and generated significant payoffs to what we know now. And as we went through feeling the effects of the great financial crisis that took place in 2008 and 2009, and then currently now the pandemic. So as a result of these efforts, following, the financial sector has entered this current pandemic crisis from a position of strength. While financial institutions may, it's acknowledged, become still cautious, there have been no disruption in credit flows. Further, as businesses experience financial stress during the movement restrictions that have been implemented to contain the spread of the pandemic, also needed are the mechanisms for debt restructuring for existing borrowers and credit guarantees to give access to new borrowers. This is over and above the moratoriums and reliefs that have been extended to businesses. Finally, I would like to conclude on what has been mentioned already, regional financial integration in Asia, in particular in ASEAN, but also in terms of East Asia, that includes the +3, the major economies in East Asia. Most economies in Asia are saving economies. It has therefore been important that some part of these savings are reinvested in productive investments in Asia. We have known earlier that much of our investments are then have flowed into developed financial markets. However, following the integration efforts and development of financial markets and in Asia and the maturity that they have now gained, it has resulted in some part of the investment being channeled to productive investments in Asia. So this has been the motivation of financial integration in Asia. Much has been achieved on this front, but however, and I take note of some of the initiatives that have been made both in the capital markets and in the banking sector and the insurance sector, but it currently still remains an unfinished business. But the progress in ASEAN demonstrates its focus has also been in climate change and environmental sustainability. And we have seen many breakthroughs on this front. And of course, it has been mentioned, and I would like to mention it again, the standards for green and sukuk issuance And this is important. This will facilitate impact of finance on the environmental sustainability. So in conclusion, I would like to say that I have great confidence that these trends and this greater cooperation and collaboration within the region will realize the recovery and sustainability agenda as we advance forward to 2030. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing your own discussions in this area.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sethi, for a very useful framing of the conversation that we'll be having here today, and for outlining many significant priority policies on financing for development. I would like also to invite you and Dr. Aladdin to stay on if you have the time for the panel discussions, because we will have many speakers today and hope to have lively discussions based on this very important topic. So with that, without further ado, I just would like to continue our conversation and hear from our very distinguished panelists that have gathered here today. As you can see from the panel of speakers today, we have the speakers that encompass an extensive range of experience and depth of expertise. So the following session will be structured around 6 questions, which I will address to each of our speakers. I would kindly request that interventions be limited to 10 minutes each. And after the presentations, the floor will be open for interactive discussion, and there may be opportunities for further observations. I encourage and welcome the questions through the chat box in this platform. Let me now start with the first speaker, Dr. Amalia Adin Alinga Winyansanti, Senior Advisor to the Minister for Economy and Financing, Minister of National Development Planning, Bappenas, Indonesia. So Dr. Amalia, in response to the unprecedented pandemic, countries in Asia and the Pacific have deployed trillions of dollars for emergency health response and relief measures for households and firms. While such spending was essential, it will no doubt create unprecedented challenge to balance the national budget for most developing countries, such as in Indonesia. So in this context, how do we integrate policies and investment plan in national budget to recover from COVID-19 and financing the SDGs? So Dr. Amalia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. At this important moment, I would like to share with you regarding to what Indonesia is actually doing, especially for mitigating the risk from COVID-19 pandemic. We realized that the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on SDGs is very broad. It will cause negative effect to almost every goals, and in particular for goal 3, goal 1, and goal 8 for sure. But the thing is that I would like to share with you that in especially in government annual plan 2021, we already revisited the theme and the priorities for our next year development plan. And we will focus very much on economic recovery. And we also will be doing some reforms, focus on health system reform, social protection system reform, and disaster resilience system reform. And with this a huge plan, including economic recovery and reforms, actually we are relaxing our budget deficit for next year into minus 6.34%. Usually that we are very strict in budget deficit, because according to our law, our state budget law, that Indonesia budget deficit cannot exceed minus 3% to GDP. But during the COVID-19 pandemic, we really put a relaxation on our fiscal rule. Then we relax our budget deficit into minus 6.34%. And then because we need a lot of budget and a lot of money to do that. Sorry, probably I will repeat again that our budget deficit for this year, 2020, is minus 6.34%. And for next year, we are running a budget deficit in minus 5.3% to finance all these needs for economic recovery and doing the 3 reforms that we are really keen to implement it by next year. And the other one is that what I would like to say is that Indonesia also doing the quite huge fiscal response to the COVID-19 economic recovery, especially in this year. We are putting money about 695 trillion rupiah this year for fiscal stimulus. 30% of it is directed to consumption support, like social assistance and subsidies. 19% of it for compensation payment. 19% of it as well for equity and investment. 15% for tax support, and also credit subsidy, and also for additional sectoral spending such as tourism and housing, and the rest of it is for supporting our local government. So the total number of fiscal stimulus and fiscal response that Indonesia is doing this year is about 695 trillion rupiah. Indonesia investment condition amid COVID-19 pandemic is actually tax allowance is finally issued by our investment coordinating board, and also tax allowance is a form of incentive offered to investors who make a new investment or business expansion in certain fields of certain regions. And also the number of submission for business identification number recorded by the online single submission system for the month of August increased by 665% compared to July 2020. And but on top of it, as you know, that Indonesia also stipulated the new omnibus law. This is, we call it in Bahasa law on Cipta Kerja, meaning that in English, it is the new law on employment, where this is actually the omnibus law that really provide a good incentive for investment and reduce burden for investors. And we also put a better investment climate and business climate to support the economic recovery of Indonesia during and after COVID-19 pandemic. I think this new law will be very critical and very powerful for Indonesia to really make a good balance between fiscal stimulus and also still to create a conducive environment for businesses to do business expansion or new investment in Indonesia. And this is actually the progress of investment. And the way forward, we really would like that financing SDGs in the new normal is still a must. And Indonesia is really mainstream the SDGs into our national development plan. And besides stimulus, fiscal stimulus package and monetary policy easing that Indonesia have done so far, policy response must also be about rebuilding better towards sustainable development in several aspects. We strengthen public and private investment in sustainable development practices, such as building resilient infrastructure. We also strengthen social protection systems, additional investment in crisis prevention, risk reduction and planning, as well as we also trying to eliminate trade barriers and restrictions that affect supply chains. So we are focusing on, as I mentioned before, in 2021, we really push forward to accelerate economic recovery and social reforms, focusing on recovery of industry, investment, and tourism in next year, and social system reform, health system reform, disaster resilient system reform, and food security reform. So what is the way forward that Indonesia is planning to do? We utilize SDGs agenda as an area of collaboration in accelerating economic recovery and social reform within and among stakeholders. Because SDGs is a very powerful vehicle for us to really build and strengthen the collaboration among stakeholders. The second one is to conduct the synergy among national and subnational level, especially for implementing the strategic development goals through the implementation of vital major projects. The third is synergy among stakeholders for adaptive response to COVID-19 pandemic as a part of economic and social transformation of new normal while preserving the environment. And the last one is to strengthen international collaboration among SDG stakeholders, among countries, and among and with development partners. So I think number 4 and number 1 is really support the achievement of Goal 17. That partnership is very much needed during this era. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Amalia, for this very comprehensive presentation. Actually, Indonesia is also one of the member states that is very active in financing areas and have proposed many interesting topics, to align the national economic and financial policy development towards SDG. So we're very happy with that, and thank you for sharing your insights on the development so far. Let me now move on to the next speaker, Ms. Kiki Kin Aswi, Director, Securities Exchange Commission of Myanmar. Ms. Kiki, the Southeast Asia sub-region has been hit hard by the COVID-19, which has led to multiple crises, including health, economic, and death crisis. To build back better post-pandemics, attracting domestic and international institutional investment through the development of sustainable finance become even more crucial. Against this backdrop, what is your opinion to leverage the role of capital market to attract sustainable finance and investment, and how regional cooperation and international community could support least developed countries like Myanmar in promoting the sustainable finance and investment? Ms. Kiki, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Timtex. Okay, can you hear me? Thank you, Mr. Timtex.
Yes, we can hear you and see you. Thank you.
So here, I would like to explain about your questions in 3 parts. One is the rules of capital market, and the second is the current power situation, and the third is the supporting of regional cooperation and international community. Next slide, please. Okay. The present COVID-19 pandemic impact on health, social, and economic globally, especially the health sector and financial and capital market. Capital market and financial market is significantly impacted. During that period, stock market experienced significant decline coupled with the capital outflow, causing the decline in market and depreciations of exchange rates across the region. In ASEAN stock market index in Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Thai, Vietnam declined considerably during the first week of the outbreak in March 2020. So if we look at the IPO volume increasing 33% as compared to Q1 2019, capital raising activity have more moderate since Q2 2020. Only 79 IPO took place in the first 3 quarters of this year as compared to the last year same period. Mergers and acquisition also stood at the $29 billion across 154 transactions for the first half of the 2020. This is the higher than last year. MSME's business experienced significantly disruptions to their business during the COVID-19 outbreak due to the containment of measure and movement restrictions, which result in loss of revenues and increased liquidity needs. Governments and central bank and capital market regulators were switched to their response and policy action and deploy a number of physical, monetary, and capital market related measures to maximize the adverse economic effects of pandemic, to measure the business to contain the outbreak, as well as to reduce the regulatory burdens. Countries have eased their monetary policy since the beginning of the outbreak by cutting interest rates, lowering regulatory reserve requirements, and providing the financial assistance, including demand. So we introduced the physical stimulus packages, including the financial subsidy and social safety nets, tax deferral, and exemption aimed to the supporting of the business and household. Many countries has also implemented target policy to support the MSME segments, which is important contributing to the country's economy. Access to financing for MSME has been facilitated through the low interest loan. Currently, direct access to short-term financing for the liquidity and cash flow through the capital market remain limited in availability for MSME. Capital market regulators in region have also responded with a number of measures to provide the greater operational flexibility for capital market players and to ensure continuity of the capital market function. Although various physical, monetary, and regulatory measures have provided temporarily relief from the current pressure points, the COVID-19 pandemic had a deep effect on the business operation and overall capital market environment. Another one is the contributing to strengthening the financial development. Region is still requiring the significant infrastructure development to support the continued growth. So according to the ADB, estimates of investment need for ASEAN is very $28 trillion or $184 billion annually from 2016 to 2030. That means the region has not only revenue for the COVID recovery, but also for the sustainable infrastructure development. Capital markets have a potential to bridge the needs of long-term institutional investor and sustainable infrastructure development. Recovery and building resilience of the economies are non-priority that must be supported by both public and private financing. The capital market will play a big role in the helping making of the right resources allocation. At the same time, investors are looking for the return in low-rate environments. Thus require a broaden of their traditional investment choice to obtain the return of the need to preserve and grow their wealth. That is why the development of sustainable taxonomy, standard guidance, and the best practice have an important role in facilitating greater conformity in the classification of capital market products, risk management, investing, disclosure, and reporting practice. Next slide, please. Thank you. So now we are if we're talking about our capital market, is the very young market in ASEAN region compared with the other ASEAN member states. We have the only equity and government treasury bond market. Government bond market introduced in 1993 and issued the treasury bonds and bill. We switched out the auction system in 2016. So the primary market of government treasury bond buyers are banks and securities companies. Secondary market is not well developed. Only insurance company and some organizations are participate in secondary market through the banks and securities company. In the equity market, the Securities and Exchange Laws was enacted in 2030 and the Security Exchange Commission was born in 2014. WISA is also established in 2015 December and traded with the 6 listed company through 6 securities company. Market capitalization is 656 billion Myanmar jet. That is very small compared with the other country. Small numbers of investors is around 49,000 and only 1.8% of the investors is active traders. The effect of the COVID pandemic again, trading decreased slightly. Foreigner investment was allowed in WISA early this year, but it's not active right now because of the pandemics and travel restriction. Next slide, please. Thank you. So Myanmar need to develop the market in line with the regional trend and integration. So Myanmar Sustainable Plan was introduced in 2018. MSTV is attached almost importance to both political and economic stability, applying peace and regional reconciliation on the political side, as well as strong and macroeconomics management and good governance on the economic side. MSTV also focus for encourage equitable and inclusive private sector development, strike right balance between economics and social development. The environmental potential and sustainability to mitigating the poverty through the country and has developed comprehensive strategies to address its issues. This MSTV is structured with the 3 pillars, 5 goals, and the 28 strategy and 251 action plans. All are firmly aligned with the SDG, the 12-point economic policy of Unions of Myanmar, and various regional commitments, which Myanmar has made part of the Greater Mekong South region's strategic framework, and the ASEAN Economic Community, and many others. Next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry. Please back the slide, please. Yes. So, concerning with the goal number 5, natural resources and environment for the prosperity of the nation, that highlights the green investment. So Myanmar has the drafting the green economy framework, which is developed by the Green Economic Development Working Committee with the help of the WWF Fund. Myanmar is the world's natural capital, including forests, biodiversity, and some of the area that has free flow rivers. Myanmar economy as well as the people depend on the healthy nature capital. As such, there's a need for investment to enhance the country's natural capital as well as to ensure the environment is safeguarded from harmful investment. Myanmar needs investment that can bring multiple and stimulate social, environmental, and economic benefit. Green policy framework is guiding a document for identifications of investment that can support the green economy in Myanmar and deliver the multi-benefit to people, environment, and the economy. It defines the physical and other policy needed as well as capacity building awareness. The frameworks can be used by the sectoral ministry as well as the multi-sectoral agency to design medium-term development plan. To prioritize and public investment as well as the support of the development of union and state region budgets. This draft was approved by the National Environmental Conservation and Climate Change Central Committee. That's still draft. So the draft was made by the many consultation meeting. 15 meeting was the state and regional level. The main objectives of these consultation meetings were to increase understand the values of nature assets, enrich people and economy depend, raise awareness about the green economy principle, identify the priority environmental issue to be addressed by the government of Myanmar, and identify the types of investment need to support sustainable developments in Myanmar, states and region. That's the 4 principles and the 4 objectives. The next step is according to the draft, the next step is to develop the green finance in Myanmar. So in line with these MSDB and the green policy, and also in line with the ACMF, Myanmar Capital Markets Roadmap is drafting now. Thus, we focus in 5 areas: strengthening foundation, our market development, catalyzing products, enable to access to underserved area, raising awareness and capacity building program, and increasing connectivities to regional. Next slide, please. This is the supporting of the regional cooperation and the international community. For the Myanmar market development, government of Japan Financial Services Agency is the key supporter to establishment of Myanmar stock market. The security exchange laws, rules, and regulations were developed by the help of the Japan governments, PRI, and FSC. Now FSC is continuous support to the capacity building and the technical assistance. ABMI also support for the development of the bond. ADB is the support for the bond market development through the capacity building program. IFC is the initial partner of corporate governance introduction in Myanmar company. We make a corporate governance analysis to public company and release the report to corporate governance status in Myanmar 2019. Now IFC also support for the corporate bond framework and the pilot project that is under process. As Myanmar is the frontier market, there's no corporate culture. So OECD is helping to develop the CG culture in Myanmar. Now we are drafting the CG notification. Myanmar also engaged with the other partner side, Thai SCC, for the capacity.
Excuse me. So perhaps I will kindly ask you to perhaps kind of wrap up your presentations because
yes,
yes, thank you very much.
That will be finished. So others partners are working together with our market development for the technical assistance. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very coincident that you already also in your presentation. I hope I didn't disrupt anything important, but thank you very much for such a comprehensive presentation, and certainly this capital market development roadmap and also Myanmar green economy policy being drafted. So it's very clear that countries in ASEAN, especially both Indonesia and Myanmar, care about these sustainable development goals. Here at UNSCAP, we also work on the capital market development and help member states in the region develop their bond market. So we hope that in your future slide will be one of your partner in your concluding slide on that front. So thank you very much. And with the capital market work in Myanmar, I think it is very good that we have the honor of Mr. Cedric Bridgman, ASEAN Program Manager, Climate Bond Initiative, to share with us his insights as the next speaker. So, Mr. Cedric, we are observing that the bond market, especially for green bond, remained robust during the pandemic. In your opinion, what does this opportunity tell you for policymakers, financial institutions, and private sector on greening the capital market? How the green financing, such as green bond issuance, could support greener recovery framework in Southeast Asia? Mr. Cedric, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I'm Cedric Rimo, the ASEAN Program Manager of Climate Bonds Initiative. I will present you today on how the bond market is responding to the current pandemic. But beyond the pandemic, there is an underlying trend in the world of growing thematic bond issuance. These bonds are traditional instruments that many investors use to invest their assets on behalf of clients. And they find investment opportunities in the form of securities, which can be either green bonds, sustainability bonds, social bonds, as well as green loans, sustainability-linked loans, and sustainability-linked bonds. So a great variety of instruments are available to them. And we have seen a very strong growth in this market of thematic bonds. For example, the global bond market represents about $100 trillion of assets outstanding. The green bond market itself this year has reached $1 trillion, which is 1% of the total bond market outstanding globally. And this has been achieved in only a few years. So even if it's still a small number, it's a very significant part of the market already. We've also seen a very strong growth recently on loans, green loans, and sustainability-linked loans. Actually, sustainability-linked loans have represented the fastest growing area of this market in 2018 and 19. And in response to the pandemic, we've seen a steady flow of issuance of what has been branded as pandemic bonds in response to COVID, where issuers have come to market to raise capital to finance projects in response to the crisis. Next slide, please. This market is underpinned by very strong principles which boil down to standards. Since 2014, the International Capital Markets Association has created a series of principles that are guiding the issuance of such securities. For example, the green bond principles are organized around 4 core components: the use of proceeds, which means what is the capital being used for? Second, what is the process for the selection of the projects that are financed from these bonds? Third, how these proceeds are managed, and essentially issuers are creating a separate account where the capital is parked and allocated only to those projects that have been selected. And finally, the reporting component is a strong element of those principles as well, in that it ensures that projects are executed with full transparency, and investors really value this extra level of disclosure. There is another option within the principles, which is to seek an external review from a third-party provider that will verify that those steps are followed. And that's ensuring, again, full transparency on these principles. Next slide, please. At Climate Bonds Initiative, we have built on those standards, and we have created what we have called a taxonomy for green bonds. For different sectors of the economy, we've worked with scientific experts in that field to design standards to help issuers select projects that are aligned with the Paris Agreement. And the focus here is on carbon emissions. So for each of those sectors of the economy, for example, in the energy space, for solar, for wind, for geothermal, and so on, we have released standards that are available freely on our website, where issuers can check whether the projects they want to select for investment are aligned with the Paris Agreement. And again, it's a way of ensuring that the capital is allocated to good uses that are aligned with the objectives of limiting the effects of climate change. So this taxonomy is still under development. There are still some sectors that are, being worked on because they may be more complex to define. For example, agriculture is a sector that is quite difficult to define in all its peculiarities. But we are progressing steadily on releasing those standards to market. For example, we have released a very recent one on shipping, which is very interesting in helping the shipping industry progress towards a zero carbon future. This work, again, is based on the scientific knowledge that we have and also sharing with investors. So we are working with groups of both the scientific experts and the investor teams to come with these standards. Similar initiatives are also happening. China has its own, for example, definitions, and the European Union is also working on a set of standards. So this is very much happening at different places in the world, and this is a way to help investors make better investment choices and to ensure that projects are selected again and avoiding what is commonly branded as greenwashing, which is basically saying when projects are actually not achieving what they are intended to do. Next slide, please. We have recently released a new set of principles at Climate Bonds Initiative, which is about guiding issuers towards what we call a credible transition to a zero carbon future. This is very new. These transition principles have been worked on with some investors as well. And they are organized so that even companies or even governments that have activities that are not aligned yet with the Paris Agreement can design a strategy to progress towards this 1.5 degree trajectory. And those principles are based on an alignment with the Paris Agreement, which is to achieve zero carbon by 2050 and halving emissions by 2030. Second, these goals must be established by science. All goals and pathways must be led by scientific experts. This is very important and harmonized across countries. Third, those principles calls for the fact that offsets cannot be counted towards a credible transition. And this transition should also include upstream scope 3 emissions. So that is really the whole strategy of the issuer that is being looked at. Fourth, the technological viability can be considered, even if currently this technological solution hasn't reached economic competitiveness. And fifth, we want to see actions and not pledges. It's very important that the projects that are being financed are actually happening on the ground. So this set of standards principles, have been announced at our last conference, and we are working with a number of parties to bring them into our criteria. And that's a very important next stage of the discussion. Next slide, please. So who are the entities that are using this green bond market to finance projects? It's actually quite a diverse population. Sovereign issuers are an important part of the population. So it can be sovereign issuers or government-backed entities or local governments. So these green bonds issued by those issuers are financing public projects to create climate resilience for the society. Development banks have been, in the past, big issuers of green bonds, but proportionally to the whole market, they have become slightly less important. It has been taken over by non-financial corporates and financial corporates, which are now big issuers of this market. And the third, another aspect of the private market is driven by asset-backed securities for 10%. Next slide, please. In terms of what types of projects are being financed by green bonds, it's mostly three main sectors that are dominating at the moment. The energy space, so solar energy, hydropower, and so on. The second sector is green buildings, either for commercial uses or residential uses, even upgrades as well can qualify. So the energy we consume within buildings are a big contributor to carbon emissions. So this is a sector also that is traditionally easy to finance with green bonds. The third sector is transport, low carbon transport solutions, including railways, with some very successful issuance, even in ASEAN, for example, with the issuance of the BTS group, a green bond that will finance 2 new lines of transportation in the Thai capital. After that, there are other sources, other industry segments that are being financed, like water management systems or waste as well. Next slide, please. So in the broader Asian region, the large countries of issuance are China, first of all, very large market for green bonds and green loans. Australia as well, because of, I guess, the market development stage of these countries, as well as India and Japan. But in Southeast Asia, we've seen quite a steady issuance as well, either from sovereign issuers like the Republic of Indonesia, which issued 2 green sukuk, or green loans in Singapore, which are very favored in terms of financing real estate projects. In Malaysia, we've seen the emergence of an active green sukuk market as well. And in Thailand and the Philippines, we've seen a steady flow of private or corporates that are coming to market to finance projects around renewable energy as well as transportation, like I said, with the BTS group. In terms of more frontier markets, Vietnam had seen only a couple of bonds in the past. We've seen a green loan being recently closed with the help of ADB, which we have certified. And in Myanmar in 2019, there has been also a green loan for real estate projects. So this is quite interesting because it's the first signs that green finance is coming to those markets that are not yet developed in terms of having a bond market. I would say that what is driving the potential issuance in those frontier markets is obviously the existence of domestic standards and domestic regulation that would be conducive to more issuance. And apart from the thematic bond issuance, for example, Cambodia has seen a couple of corporate bond being issued already and in local currency. And maybe this is the first stage towards having also some green bonds in the future being issued. So a lot of diversity in Southeast Asia with different types of issuers as well as different types of securities. We've seen, for example, in the Philippines, a bank go out to the Swiss franc green bond market and issue a very successful transaction at a negative yield, which, given the current state of the market, is possible. We've also seen a renewable energy issuer issue a perpetual green bond, which is the first in the region. Next slide, please.
Cedric, I also would like to ask you to kindly, wrap up the presentation. Thank you.
Okay. So next slide, please. So in terms of issuing a green bond, if we can flip to the next slide, please. It follows the normal bond issuance process, but on top of that, an issuer needs to have a green bond framework set up, identify projects, and put in place a selection process for eligible projects, and get an external review from a third-party provider and after that it follows the normal bond issuance. Next slide, please. It involves a lot of different parties, including obviously the issuer, but also its clients, its suppliers, in terms of looking at the whole supply chain and creating a full story around what types of projects are being selected. Advisors are also important in terms of, for example, the verifiers. We've seen 2 new verifiers being approved by Climate Bonds Initiative in Thailand with TRIS rating, in Malaysia as well with RAM. And this is very helpful to support local issuance as well. The banks are very important in terms of helping issuers structure the transaction and having access to investors and coming to market. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is an issuance process that is well organized, that takes different steps. The preparation of the projects is important. The verification is critical in defining the relationship with investors. Getting the certification helps as well to support the access to investors. And after the bond has been issued, the annual report is very important to maintain this disclosure as well. Next slide, please. Why use green bond for green recovery? To conclude, first of all, because they marry environmental concerns with economic growth and global finance. They are all about transitioning to a low carbon economy. They are part of the national debates on how countries can create sustainable development pathways, as well as for companies. They also allow to bring future value into present capital for investments. So that's very important in a region where there is a lot of needs for capital for future investment. Bonds are a tool where governments as well as private companies can really finance investments today by unlocking future value of what they are achieving. And bonds are well understood instruments. This is why they are so popular with investors, and this is a way to achieve, to access global capital. Thank you very much, and I remain at your disposal for questions.
Thank you very much, Cedric, for a very useful presentation on green bonds, thematic bonds, and how to issue them. Actually, we are working also closely with Cedric to implement some activities for member states in the regions on bond market development. So I'm sure that there may be some questions for you later on these very interesting new trends on these bonds that care about sustainability. So let me now move on to our next speakers, Mr. Rajiv Kumar Gupta, Program Manager for the Shaping Inclusive Finance Transformations, United Nations Capital Development Fund. Mr. Gupta, the absence of timely and sustained support could magnify the scale of financing challenges and potentially harm the marginalized group, such as women, youth, and small business. At the same time, we see unprecedented shift through digital platform in every line of activities, including financing. In this context, how can we reap the benefit of digital financial inclusion in Southeast Asia during and in the aftermath of this pandemic? Mr. Gupta, you have the floor.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Thintep, and thanks to SCAP for having me in this event for discussions on this important topic. Good morning to everyone. I'm sorry I don't have a presentation to make. I'll be speaking on this. You are right that the present crisis offers an opportunity to build better systems to support financial inclusion and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and enabling us to provide access to safe, affordable financial services. I think we need to see the 3 phases, the pre-COVID, the present, and the post-COVID of change. And what's the change been there in the digital and financial space before we look at reaping the benefit of digital financial inclusion. Pre-COVID phase itself, if you talk about Southeast Asia, or if you talk about globally, digital and specific mobile money has been the key drivers of financial inclusion over the years. Payments, remittances, credit uptakes. Just as an example, in Thailand, 74% of internet users access banking through mobile devices, well ahead of the global rate of 41%. In Indonesia, e-money transactions jumped to 173% from January 2019 to January 2020. Vietnam, though still being a cash economy, digital payments have been surging 144% per year over the past 5 years. As UNCDF, we have been partnering with both the public and the private sector to promote such digital financial inclusion initiatives, ranging from payments, credit remittances, alternate credit scoring, B2B payments, savings, supply chain financing, and all. What has happened during the COVID is that there has been a substantial acceleration of adoption of digital channels. And this has been kind of a conditionality if one has to really look at not losing out on customers, being interactive and transactive in the present scenario, and the governments being able to support the population and enterprises by enabling those transfers to happen digitally. And so the socioeconomic environment has pushed people to adopt digital mechanisms. And this was similar to what happened after SARS in China or post-demonetization in India. Just as an example, after COVID-19 arrived in Myanmar, the fintech solutions quickly proved to be very effective. And the government's COVID-19 economic relief plan, there were distributions happening through local digital platforms like PayMoney, OnePay, GCash in Philippines. There saw a 700% increase in transaction volumes year on year in May. And so there are this kind of exponential growth that we have seen in the use of digital mechanisms and digital financial services. The next phase, the post-COVID, would certainly define how sustained these would be and lead to sustainable impact. And the more we talk to stakeholders in this space, they say that this is here to stay. This is here to stay. It's not that people will be moving back to the cash economy. And as we have moved from the past, when we used to talk about financial inclusion to now digital inclusion, and we are speaking about digital economies now, sustained contribution and impact of digitalization in finance can only happen if the future pathways are made more safe and inclusive with an open ecosystem operating. And for realizing this transformative benefits, there are 3 areas that we need to ensure further work on and growth in. One is digital infrastructure. As you mentioned rightly about marginalized population, the reason is why and how they get marginalized in this digital world. That needs to be looked into. And the reason is more of invisibility, because most of them are in the informal economy and their lives and livelihoods gets combined as single identities. And they're unable to fully tap into the digital finance space of access and use. And for financially excluded people who do not have bank accounts, government-issued identification or other documentation, increased digitalization, will represent an additional barrier and also risks widening the digital divide. Therefore, the infrastructure we develop must be directed at enabling inclusion. And I would just point out 3 basic areas, and Southeast Asia has been a driver of that, to work further and mainstream that kind of digital infrastructure. One is on the digital identity systems, and this has been in most of the countries. But the invisibility of these micro and vulnerable enterprises that we talk about, that also needs to be seen because they're quite unorganized and informal. How do you identify them so that you can service them, you can benefit them, you can transact with them? The second is on simplified account opening so that there's less hassle, but also looking into all the risks and the protection aspects that needs to be there. And the third is the interoperable electronic payment mechanisms that needs to be quite ingrained and mainstream into the systems. And this will really, together with the rails that's needed in terms of network coverage, internet penetration, would then in particular enable financial transfers and payments and will be invaluable in addressing COVID-19 and beyond. In terms of network coverage also, Southeast Asia is not a single cohesive markets. And if you measure by internet penetration, which is very uneven and ranges from 81% in Singapore to 22% in Laos. So we really need to look into those kind of investments to really make digital financial inclusion and sustainability aspects of it. The second, beyond digital infrastructure, is regulatory environment. There is a recent study done by World Bank and Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance. And the COVID-19 pandemic has shown that there has been an increase in digital payments and remittances. There has been now movement towards digital banks that you're also seeing in Southeast Asia now, and digital savings and deposits that's happening. It says that 37% of the surveyed regulators, and this was global, more than 100 countries that it was done, including Southeast Asian countries, not all of them, that 37% of the surveyed regulators have taken at least one regulatory measure specifically targeting fintech sectors or activities. And that's in relation to digital payments and remittances, that's in relation to waiving of the transaction fees or lowering transaction fees, increasing the limits of withdrawal and cash in and out. And those kind of enabling environment and creating, the capital raising frameworks has really benefited. Also, if you talk about fintechs, they have been quite active in the relief efforts in the jurisdictions in terms of, transfers, digital disbursements of payment remittances, delivery of government reliefs and stimulus funding, healthcare applications, binding to healthcare applications for contract tracing, ensuring business continuity and support to enterprises. It has now become very essential for the authorities looking at the future of digital economies and digital financial services, that inclusion that we talk about, to upgrade supervisory data systems and implement regulatory technologies, RegTech and SupTech that we talk about, in order to enhance the achievement of regulatory and supervisory objectives, particularly alongside the development of core digital infrastructure. The second within the regulatory aspect is to be quite agile and open to the testing and piloting platforms. And of course, in ASEAN and the Southeast Asia countries, we see that test and learn approach, wait and see, because then you're able to support innovations by licensed institutions. And then there is a need for harmonizing approaches at regional level to help reach scale. All these digital technologies need scale to operate on. And the policymakers and regulators will need to focus particularly on benefits of regionally harmonizing regulatory frameworks for fintechs. And for example, in the ASEAN Economic Committee, there is initiatives around ASEAN Payments Policy Framework for cross-border real-time cross-border payments. You have cross-border interoperability of standardized quick response codes. So those are the initiatives that's going on. The third and the major also, apart from digital infrastructure and regulatory, is the innovation and the literacy ecosystem that needs to be worked on. I would leave the literacy aspects as my fellow panelist colleague would be speaking more about that. But enabling a fintech ecosystem needs to support innovation while promoting financial sustainability, market integrity, and consumer protection. Inclusive digital economies is what we all strive for, and innovations in this space that enables digital finance at the starting point of onboarding towards it, or enables digital finance to leverage on other digital and technology solutions. This has become very important. For example, in agriculture, we cannot talk about digital finance unless we also have the digital transactions and digital footprints and digital supply chain integrations aspects of things also being talked about. To get the focus back on the real economy issues and leaving no one behind in this digital era that we talk about, UNCDF has developed now an inclusive digital economy scorecard tool that enables governments and private sector stakeholders to identify gaps and plan actions to address inclusivity issues to achieve SDGs. Innovation also is needed in how digital finance operates and supports the population and enterprises. It is all about having a digital footprint. in both individuals' lives and livelihoods. Whether the starting point of this digital footprint is non-financial, digital services or digital financial services, we need to accelerate this digital data creation. Then only it will enable finance to flow, which is just not about payments. We are talking about savings, credit, insurance, remittances. And this is going to enable us to move from digital financial inclusion to the real aspect and issues of achieving the financial health, which is the ultimate goal. Also, sustainable inclusion can take place if we invest into developing various instruments and platforms that ride on digital and offer finance to ride on them. With fiscal space issues due to the present pandemic, there is a need for digital finance models that enables mobilization of domestic resources and enables citizens to participate in ensuring SDG investments that they can benefit from. Digital offers new mechanisms to be created and to mobilize these citizen savings and then to invest into SDG infrastructure. Create platforms to address MSME enterprise financing, micro, small, and medium enterprise financing, and linking to the capital markets, and many other such examples are there. We have been working on such initiatives in Bangladesh and Zimbabwe at present. And despite this whole drive towards digital, I think there is also a need to look at the startup ecosystem. Just as an example, Indonesia ranks among the top 5 countries in terms of number of startups. And it has been doing great in terms of the fintech startups that's also there. And now with the big technology we talk about, big tech that we talk about, and scales we talk about, and in the present pandemic, there is a need to look at how these fintechs are being affected and these startups are being affected. There's a tightening of funding, rising non-performing loans, a decline in transactions and credit.
Excuse me, I also need to ask you to...
Sorry, I'll just take 30 seconds more.
Sure, thank you.
And some of them, these fintechs have halted new lending since onset of lockdowns. So we need to really look into these so that there's a competitive environment and an open market ecosystem environment that is enabling the sustainability of digital financial inclusion in Southeast Asia. I'll stop at that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A very pertinent trend on digital transformation in Southeast Asia that you mentioned. Certainly, this topic is going to be very, very important going forward. And how can consumers, customers, SMEs, even regulators will keep up with all these new innovation and digital platform. But certainly, yes, very pertinent with these insights that you're giving in terms of this trend on digital finance. And with that, I think one part of the of any financing or digital finance is an important role of financial literacy. So today we have the next speaker, Professor Dr. Randall Channel, College of Management, Mahidol University, to talk about this important issue. So Professor Randall, the OECD in their report shows that financial literacy in Southeast Asia remains low. On top of that, now we are adapting to sustainable finance, which are relatively new concept, not only for household, financial institutions, and private sector, but also for policymakers. With this in mind, what do you think is the role of financial literacy in enhancing sustainable investment? We're also putting effort to build back better from COVID-19 in the perspectives. I think if you can also touch upon something on digital finance, it's literacy, that would be great. Thank you very much, Dr. Randall. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. In our Sustainability Center, we're increasingly conducting research about various issues, but my particular area is more about successful aging. And we see the populations are getting older and older, and people are living longer, which then leads to a variety of other sustainability issues, because then we consume more food, more water, we produce more waste, but also think about healthcare or health and wellness and caregivers. So basically looking at this, we find that successful aging or life satisfaction in later life mostly is driven by health and wealth. And so preventative health and also financial literacy and financial behaviors become, so far, the two most important issues. And sadly to say, we find that consumers were already getting more and more into debt before COVID came along. We find that financial literacy is very low. We find that people tend to start saving too late in life, and they save too little, and they save too conservatively. By that I mean they use savings accounts, if they have a bank account at all. So on the one side, we're certainly seeing a lot of doom and gloom. The companies are suffering and the economy is not good. And so then we have easy credit, and then we have everything on sale, pushing the consumers and trying to stimulate consumption. And so we have this kind of dichotomy. Well, they were already in debt, so now we have to be really careful about trying to educate consumers at different stages in life about the importance of saving for different goals, like saving for your children's education, saving for your own retirement. We have to try to become more mindful about sustainable consumption, not taking on excessive debt. And otherwise, we're facing a real time bomb, and it also depends on policies. So we have more and more people going online in emerging markets. They're using their smartphones and tablets and now spending more time online, which is very similar to the trends way back when TV became popular, because it increases awareness of products and brands and stimulates consumption through marketing and advertising. And so we may see more compulsive consumption and even more problems with that, especially with the easy credit. But when I said kind of regulation dangers, what if the banks start to allow people to mortgage their homes? And we've seen this in history before too, because then maybe the children and the grandchildren end up carrying the debt from a previous generation. So I guess I'm trying to raise awareness that these issues were already dangers, and now they might be accelerating because of digital, because of people being online. Even if you don't have a bank account, you can use AirPay or whatever and still shop online. What we found in our research so far is, again, low financial literacy and yet also distrust. So people don't really trust the financial institutions or the financial advisors. And so they're searching online to try to find their own solutions. And so I would say, more research in this area would help us see also maybe some policies to help educate people at different stages of life. So when you're really young, it's good to learn about sustainable consumption and avoiding excessive debt or waste. But it's not until they get older that they start to earn, revenue, and they start to think about savings. Sometimes they're already in their 30s before they even begin saving. And then people don't have enough money and they end up stopping. So basically what we found in research from psychology is that the longer a behavior runs, the less likely it is to change. So that's why it's really important that we educate people early on about the importance of savings and the importance of preventative health, exercising regularly, and hope that it sticks long term.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Randall, for your insights on the behavioral of people here I'm not sure whether that's in this country or in globally or Asia Pacific.
Yeah, actually the findings have been pretty similar globally, but most of what I was talking about just now is from within Thailand.
Okay, yes. Yes, I think we have pretty much a lot of household debt here, so we have to start perhaps saving early and more, as you mentioned. So thank you very much, Mr. Randall, for your insights. I have one more questions for last but not least important speaker. For this, I am grateful to have Ms. Yok Ling of Third World Network, Malaysia. So, Ms. Yok Ling, it seems that the containment measures such as lockdowns, have led to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as air and water pollution. However, this could prove to be only temporary as economic activity resumes, and we risk locking in a high carbon and unsustainable recovery path. Could you share your views on how to design recovery policies and mobilize finance that aligns with the ambitions of SDGs and the Paris Agreement? I also would like to ask the audience to feel free to post your questions on the chat box because the panel discussion is about to wrap up soon. So Ms. Yokling, for this, I would like you to take the floor. Have the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to join this panel. On behalf of the Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism that has worked very, very well with SCAP in these past years, I was nominated by them, and so many of what I say are actually shared by many of our colleagues in the civil society organizations across the region. Yes, definitely, your reference to how the forced lockdown across the world has actually reduced a lot of pollution and carbon emissions, but that is not the way we envisaged the sustainability pathway. So now we will have a dilemma because the economic recovery, the social needs from the micro firms to the big national firms and airlines require governments to really, put in a very sophisticated package of policies and measures that are both emergency response as well as recovery, as well as also because this pandemic is not just going to go away. It's not a need before, during, and after. What we're seeing now already are waves. Yeah, they will spike up, and because the transmission, is going on, is in the community. So we will see while we are grappling with the long-term challenges of transformation, which is what the 2030 agenda and SDGs and the Paris Agreement are about. We have a lot of short-term responses that require us to not be so sustainable. So what I want to focus on in my short presentation here is really about the kind of policy space that is challenging us in the pandemic experience, because I think many of the specific ideas have been really well covered, and already some of them are being implemented in the region by the previous speakers. So we look at climate change, really apart from, when we talk about emissions reduction, that's a mitigation part of the work. What we already see happening is that climate change is already happening. The impacts of more intense typhoons and storms and droughts are already going on. As we speak, Vietnam just had to evacuate more than 100 million people just a week ago. And the Philippines is not even every year, it's almost every 6 months where we have these more intense and more frequent weather events. So a lot of the financial resources of governments, whether you like it or not, is being actually channeled to disaster response and to adaptation. And when you have permanent loss and damage, like coastal areas and agricultural lands, then it's a lot of money that needs to be invested. And this is where we are going to face more and more problems, because the pandemic is actually challenging us to divert money to the health responses. And already health ministers across the region are grappling with how, when I take money from my existing budget to respond to COVID, I'm going to cut it from other health treatments and for preventive health, which will even go lower in the agenda if we are not careful. Yeah. So I feel that the time has come for us to look at what kind of policies and what are the constraints and opportunities that we have to be able to do this response long term for climate change, as well as to deal with the short term difficult choices of lives and livelihoods. Yeah. Now, I just want to say, and this was going to disappear from the radar because the 2030 agenda, the Paris Agreement, the Biodiversity Convention, and all the commitments which have been the global outputs for the last 30 years actually are grounded in a North-South commitment to provide financing for technology and capacity building. That is the core of the implementation of all these commitments at the global level. So South-South cooperation and domestic resource mobilization is actually complementary when we talk about the global challenges. Yeah, of course, within the country, we have to make sure we go towards the green path as well. That's for sure. But it is not enough to rely on the domestic resources, which is why cooperation is the framework for the United Nations. Now, what we are seeing happening now, because the COVID-19 is impacting the United States and Europe and other developed economies in a more harsh way, and there are separate discussions on that. Countries that had stronger public health systems, more coordinated public responses, actually are coping better. Yeah. So these countries which have these North-South commitments to finance sustainability on the G to G level, we will see that it will become even more unpredictable in these coming years. So then we come back to how we're going to mobilize our domestic resources or regional efforts. And that means we need to then go back to what kind of national policy space. Now, different types of unilateral economic liberalization, bilateral, regional, and all kinds of trade and economic agreements and investor agreements have over the last 20, 25 years actually reduced policy space, not just physical, but overall economic policy space and development planning for many countries. So, for example, zero tariffs in many of the bilateral and regional trade agreements. Zero tariffs means that governments will lose a lot of revenue. It would also expose the small local firms to maybe prematurely having to compete with multinational corporations and services when they're not ready to compete. And so when we undermine the domestic production and industries, when our foreign ownership, equity ownership of our national economies grow, then it is harder to control. I mean, from Tan Sri Zeti onwards this morning, we hear this combination of a need for surveillance, cooperation, incentives, but also surveillance, supervising, and regulation. So the regulatory space, I think, is what I want to focus on. And one of the main things that are of concern for many of us in civil society and also governments increasingly is the relationship with investors. Yeah, because in many of the investment agreements, investment contracts, and in the comprehensive trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, these have chapters on investment that have broadened the definition of investment to include intangibles like intellectual property and also expected future profits. It is not just the physical investment, but it is so broad that it actually has opened up a lot of problems in terms of the additional right that has been created in this chapters on investment, which is the right for a private investor to directly sue a national government, the host government, in private arbitration. So I want to actually show a couple of slides, if you can just put it on the screen, because investor-state dispute has become very politically controversial, economically expensive, and already there's a study by the Transnational Institute based in the Netherlands that looked at law firms. These are law firms that specialize in helping investors sue governments or advising governments when they are being sued by investors. So I want to take some quotes, and the links are there. About some of the actions on lockdown, recovery, social protection that have been going on in the last 10 months all across our region and beyond. Look at some of these quotes. One, when the actions of a government, even if nominally well-intentioned, cause injury to a foreign investor or its investment, international investment law provides protection as well as effective means of recourse against the state. When these protections are violated, the investor can bring action, and it can also have an award against the state's assets, including assets held outside of the country if you win the case. The other one says, international investment agreement obligations apply even when government measures are implemented to respond to national emergencies like COVID. For example, foreign investors successfully leveraged bilateral investment treatment to recover losses related to the Argentinian financial crisis, right back in 2001 to 2003. And this is one I particularly thought was very honest. An investor in a webinar said, I definitely think that some states will end up losing cases to investors, notwithstanding that the way it might come about will come across as unfair. Right, so this and the next slide, please. There is also the next slide, please. Yeah. There's also another law firm that has something called the client alert, where it tells its clients, the companies, that you can also let your shareholder know that the directors of companies should let the shareholders know that they can individually, in their own right, separate from the company, also take action against a host government if their investment is affected. And you can read on, okay? And UNCTAD is actually giving us a warning already. Although the measures responding to COVID I'll show you some of these measures which are being highlighted by some of these law firms. Although these measures are taken for the protection of the public interest, to mitigate the negative impact of the pandemic on the economy, some of them could, depending on the way they are implemented, expose governments to arbitration proceedings initiated by foreign investors. UNCTAD is a very useful database for all the known cases, and that's something that can be looked at. So I just want to, so this is just 2 slides. I wanted the quotes to be up there because I think this is very important for government and policymakers to be aware that already there are law firms offering the services. Yeah. Now, some of the actions that have been identified by some of these law firms that could become the basis to sue a government include, for example, classification of a business as non-essential. Right now, many of our countries are doing this. We lock down and then we will open up and then we have a list of essential services or non-essential services which we will regulate. For the law firms, this can be the basis to say you have actually expropriated the investor's interests, or you have breached something called fair and equitable treatment. Fair and equitable treatment is a ground to take action against a host government and is found in all the current investment agreements, investment contracts and trade agreements, which are more economic, broader in scope, not just trade in goods. So if you look at the database of UNCTAD and other sources, fair and equitable treatment is the basis for a lot of actions taken against government measures, policies and laws. Future profits are also included. The other class of measures that have been identified by these law firms is lockdowns causing investment to close permanently. That would be expropriation, according to them. Temporary closures of business activities could also be expropriation. Price controls, mask, PPE, medicines, that could also be expropriation, depending on your law, of course. Export restrictions could be a breach of fair and equitable treatment. Term deposit rescheduling. A lot of our banks are doing this, ordered by our central banks, right? Reducing interest rates, suspending creditor protections. This is another group of measures that could also be the basis for an investor to sue a government for compensation because of their loss of profits, including loss of future profits, which is very, very broad. So I want to highlight this because I think that all the measures that we're talking about, even without the pandemic, many of the measures to go towards the Paris Agreement, implementation, to go towards the SDGs, will really actually take the relationship with investors and society to a much more complex level of a combination of cooperation and regulation. Many of these agreements that I've highlighted are aimed at deregulation, with some exceptions here and there, but the totality is actually to constrain the hands of policymakers, lawmakers, and this is something we have to pay attention to. So one of the civil society calls to our governments in the region and across the world is to actually put a hold on all these negotiations going on in the WTO, on e-commerce, on this and that, some of the other negotiations, because these agreements in the light of COVID and what we want to do for a green pathway are actually out of date. That's why one of the most important things in the yet to be finally concluded RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, that is initiative of ASEAN, the investor-state dispute settlement provisions have been removed from the investment chapter to be discussed at a later date. If all parties agree. And that decision was taken last year because ministers of trade and commerce from ASEAN plus Japan, China, Korea, Australia, New Zealand agreed that investor-state dispute is actually something that is detrimental to national sovereignty and to the policy freedom of a country. So reviewing our existing agreements, investment contracts, is very important and urgent so that we can move forward confidently and not be sued. And I want to just end very quickly by raising the issue of worry about rising debt, because IMF has already loaned quite a lot of money to different countries. And some studies done by Oxfam and the European Network on Debt and Development are raising concerns that austerity measures are actually being also part of that package, as well as regressive taxation in some of these loans. And that response from the fiscal point of view could actually be anti what we are talking about achieving here. And the other thing that at the international level, which we hope our countries in this region can play a collective role in, is to fill up two important gaps at the international level. One is to really, for so long we've been discussing this, create a debt, a formal sovereign debt workout that is orderly and fair. And that's something that has been in discussion for a long time with no political will, unfortunately, from the high-income countries. This is something that I think we need to put in place if we look at uncertainties. And lastly, how to have progressive taxation and tax justice as well. And taxation is going to be a very important part of raising also public revenue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Yok Ling, for insightful discussion from the perspective of the CSO, and has highlighted many interesting areas for us, the government, to think about when imposing policy measures, especially during this unprecedented time. So because we have a very, very tight time limitation here, so basically we have 5 minutes left. We still have many questions coming from the floor. So I think I'll just pick perhaps at this moment just 2 questions. One is a question for Mr. Ridmond, Cedric. Are there any initiatives to set up regenerative agricultural bonds, considering the important role regenerative agriculture plays in increasing the capacity for carbon capture? Thank you.
Yeah.
Just 2 minutes.
Yes, I already replied in the chat on this question, but yes, we do have such a stream. We have been doing some work, for example, with Brazil or Mexico on striking some deals around agriculture and working with regulators and governments on how to implement such practices. So if there are any such initiatives in the ASEAN or Asia region, we can add value by explaining what we have done in other regions, and also sharing best practices on green bonds that have been issued globally in support of this industry sector. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cedric. Another question is posed to Mr. Rajiv Kumar Gupta. How do some of the proposals in the ongoing e-commerce negotiations at the WTO and the e-commerce chapter in trade agreements, such as the CPTPP, impact on the various issues you have raised that require an enabling and regulatory environments? How will digitalization impact micro, small firms in developing countries? Thank you. 1 or 2 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks. I think digitalization is the positive step forward, because that kind of gives the kind of a democratization aspect of access and use to similar services and rights and information and transactions. So the impact on the micro small firms in developing countries, if they're able to get digitalized, but that's also a challenge, because we do talk about digital, but digital is for people, and that means behavioral change. And one of the major limitations of bringing in behavioral change is that we don't invest much into it. Like my fellow panelist was talking about literacy. And that behavioral change investments is also required to be brought into, but also in a very sustainable and a commercial manner, which is not happening right now. But once we have seen working with micro and small enterprises, once they're digitalized, like the COVID-19 scenario has shown that if those who were more digital in nature were more comparatively resilient compared to those who were not digital in these scenarios, in the pandemic scenario. And in terms of the trade and the regulatory and environments, I don't think so. I'm the right. I don't have all the information related to it. But with the kind of barriers and tariff barriers that we're talking about, and the easing of it, and the kind of supply chains that we talk about, I think the regulation needs to take those into consideration in terms of not only how that's going to impact on a particular sector or the economy, but also in terms of how that is going to disadvantage a competitive environment that's going to get created, if any. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rajiv, and also Cedric earlier for his response. Actually, we have a few more questions that doesn't come from the chat, but come from the registration earlier. So we will try our best to respond to those questions after this forum. But before we conclude, I just want to say that I think we have learned many things from these important sessions. There is no doubt that finance will remain an important issue, especially during this difficult time and a prolonged period of COVID-19 pandemic, because without finance, many things cannot happen. And today we have many good insights from ASEAN Secretariat about the commitment of ASEAN Secretariat towards more green and sustainable finance with so many initiatives. Dr. Seti has set the tone for the priority areas for the Southeast Asian region. We've seen development in Indonesia about how they are committed to SDG and to implement those even in this difficult time of budgeting the extra expense to cope with COVID-19. Myanmar on green and capital market development. We've also here an expert's view on how the rise of sustainability bonds, thematic bonds, has played out during the past decades and will continue to accelerate. The importance of digital transformation and financial literacy in terms of ensuring that we will recover back better, more resilience, while people are well equipped with enough savings in their pocket. We've had valuable insights from CSO in terms of what the governments and the UN should take forward in terms of solving these problems of the COVID-19 pandemic and caution about the measures taken in terms of investor relationship. So I think today discussion is very fruitful, and I thank you very much for your lively discussion, although we don't have much time for questions, but we'll try our best to answer all your questions later on. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the distinguished speakers and participants for taking part in these sessions on Southeast Asian SDG Forum. And please stay healthy during this difficult time, and I'll see you in the next session on sub-regional progress on the cluster of sustainable development goals under review at the 2021 APFSD and HLPF. I now take this opportunity to turn the control back to Mr. Ronnie, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tintip, for that precise and on-time moderation. We will now proceed with the next session 4. And please stay tuned while we transition to the next session. Thank you very much. Welcome back to session 4, progress on sustainable development goals under review at the 2021 Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development and High Level Political Forum. So this session will be moderated by Dr. Katinka Weinberger, Chief of the Environment and Development Policy Section of the Environment and Development Division of ESCAP. Dr. Katinka, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, and good morning, Excellencies, distinguished speakers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us here in the session of the 4th Southeast Asia Multi-Stakeholder Forum on Implementation of Sustainable Development Goals, which is co-organized by ESCAP and several UN agencies here in the region. As Ronnie has said, I will be the moderator for this session, where we'll be looking at Sustainable Development Goals under review at the 2021 Asia Pacific Forum on Sustainable Development and also the High Level Political Forum. Now, the high-level political forum in 2021 will discuss quite a large number of goals. It will be looking at Sustainable Development Goal 1 on poverty, 2 on zero hunger, 3 on good health and well-being, 8 on decent work and economic growth, 10 on reduced inequalities, 12 on responsible consumption and production, 13 on climate action, 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions, and 17 on partnerships. And in doing so, the forum will consider the integrated, the indivisible, and the interlinked nature of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is surely a very long list of goals, but member states really wanted to review these goals that are closest to the COVID-19 pandemic and the impacts that it has. And this means that for us here at the regional and the sub-regional level, we will also be taking an in-depth look at these goals. But today, to keep the discussion somewhat manageable, we have invited speakers from UN agencies in the region to brief us in particular on progress of goals 1, 2, 8, and 12, and 16. And we've asked them to brief us on progress and the impact that COVID-19 has had on achieving these goals and which impact it will likely have in the near future. So we're very fortunate to have with us a group of very distinguished colleagues here today, which I will introduce in a little while. But before we start, I would like to kindly ask our speakers to keep your video on and the microphone muted if you don't speak. And for participants in the MS Teams platform, we kindly ask you to turn off both your video and to mute your microphone. So without much further ado, may I please invite the first speaker. I'm very pleased to have here with us today Mr. Bishwa Tiwari, who's the program specialist at the Bangkok Regional Hub of the United Nations Development Program, and who will speak on SDG 1 on eradication of poverty, current challenges and opportunities. Bishwa, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Katinka. Let me share my screen. Sorry, there are many. So sorry, I think, okay. So thank you, Katinka, once again. So I will be presenting on goal 1. Where is the full screen? Is it full screen there?
Yes, you're there.
Okay, thanks. So I start with 3 very simple messages, I think, which are very direct and obvious. The first one is Southeast Asia was not on track in attaining the Sustainable Development Goals even before the COVID-19 era. The second message is COVID-19 will increase poverty, both income and multidimensional. These are actually the 2 important indicators of the goal 1. There are, of course, many other indicators like social protection coverage, but those I'm not going to discuss much here, although there will be slight reference to those indicators as well. Now, the third message is that COVID-19 provides opportunities for doing things differently. Because we know that there are several challenges of the COVID-19, but I also, towards the end, talk something about the opportunities that COVID-19 brings and how we can harness those opportunities. So let me move first message. So SCAP annually produces a SDG progress report. Now we are working on the 2021 progress report. Last year we worked on 2019 progress, 2020 progress report that was launched at the APFSD. So the key findings of that progress report is very clear. It says that Asia Pacific was not on track to achieve any of the 17 SDG by 2030. This is the story about the whole region, and of course Southeast Asia as well, which I will show you in next slide. But the progress is uneven across the 5 sub-regions. The region lacks progress on environmental sustainability. We find 2 of the SDGs, SDG 12, Sustainable Consumption Production, and SDG 13, Climate Action, where the region as a whole is regressing. Now, of course, everyone, we know that there is a lack of data. There are so many indicators, we lack data. And because of the lack of data, it's really a challenge for us for the effective monitoring of the SDG as well as reporting them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that the progress across the SDGs varies by sub-region. So here are the 6 sub-regions, 5 sub-regions by SCAP. This is even SCAP sub-regions. Of them, we can see that in Southeast Asia, the red one, there are 2 SDGs where Southeast Asia is regressing.
Vishwa, sorry, apologies to interrupt. Your presentation is not moving. We still see the first slide.
Oh, really? Oops. Now is it moving now?
No, we still see the title slide.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I should have requested the colleagues over there to.
Yes. Okay, we will manage the presentation from here.
Okay,
Vishwa.
okay. So now we'll have the 4th slide, please. Please, 4th slide. Thank you very much, Katrina. I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. Thank you so much. So earlier I was mentioning that Southeast Asia is regressing in 2 of the SDGs. They are the SDG 10, reducing inequality. Another one is peace institutions, SDG 16. Now similarly the other, can you see the slide? I don't see.
No.
Apologize, Vishwa. Colleagues are working on it.
So yes. So there are, so just my point here to say that, thank you so much, now it's clear. So all these sub-regions are not able to achieve the SDG by 2013. In case of Southeast Asia, there are 2 SDGs where the region is, or sub-region is regressing. They are goal 10 and goal 16. There are 2 SDGs on goal 4 and goal 9, quality education, industry innovation, where we are on track. In most other goals, the progress is stagnant. Next slide, please. Now this is about the income poverty. So as you know, since the last couple of years, World Bank has introduced 3 income consumption poverty line. One is $1.9 a day. There is another one, $3.2 a day, and then $5.5 a day. So $1.9 a day for low-income countries, $3.2 for lower MIC, and $5.5 is the upper middle income country. So now over time, when you see the trend, between the 2000 and 2018, we see a significant reduction in income consumption poverty, or $1.9 a day or $3.2 a day poverty, as well as 5.5. There's a rapid increase in the poverty, extreme poverty, which we say $1.9 a day, but mainly by 90%, frankly speaking. Similarly, there is also very rapid decrease in the $3 a day poverty by almost 74%. Now the $5.5 a day also decreased by half, 49% or 50%. Now we see at one point I would like to mention here is that in Southeast Asia, there is no country which are lower income countries. All countries are middle income countries. And of them, frankly speaking, there are three big countries. Here I'm talking about the developing Southeast Asia, not Singapore or Brunei. So if you exclude them, then out of the other 9 countries, there are 3 countries which are populous as well as bigger. They moved, or they are in the upper middle income country, like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. So in terms of population, I think they share almost 3/4 of the Southeast Asia population. So in that sense, if you take Southeast Asia as a whole, then perhaps if you do an aggregated analysis, then in that situation, we need to use the $5.5 a day poverty line. So in that situation, you see that poverty in Southeast Asia, when we use a $5.5 a day line, is 41.6% in 2018. So if you take this into account, then perhaps 2030 we will not able to eradicate poverty. But it seems that if we consider the poverty line of $3.2 a day, then perhaps we can still attain. But please note that, I'm talking about this pre-COVID situation. The COVID factor has not been taken into account here. So still before the COVID era, there was almost 16% people living below $3.2 a day. Next slide, please. Now, similarly, this is also pre-COVID era. So generally, I mean, this is the what we can do. I mean, generally, we get the data after 1 or 2 years, and you know the multidimensional poverty index, which is another indicator for it actually monitors the target 1.2 of the SDG 1. Now there was an analysis done by the OP and UNDP and presented at the SLPF. So I borrowed the slide from there. So they have pointed out that out of the countries for which there were more than 2 or 3 points of data, so they have used, I think, a 3 model, linear, logistic, as well as constant, and based on that, they found that out of the countries for which there was more than 2 points of time data, there were about 47 countries out of 75 which are on track to achieve this 1.2 indicator, which is about multidimensional poverty. There are 18 countries which are off track. So again, this is a situation before the COVID. Next slide, please. So, but one point I would like to mention here is that none of the countries from Southeast Asia, they are off track. For which the data available, we see that there is no country from Southeast Asia which are off track to attain the multidimensional poverty by 2030. Next slide, please. Now let me come to the another message, which is about impact of the COVID. So we know that I think there is significant impact. There are so much literature on this. So I'm not going to speak in detail, but just wanted to bring some issues here. So you know, Southeast Asia has a very modest progress, or even high progress in some countries in the past decades. And because of that reason, there was also very significant decrease in poverty. But Southeast Asia has also problem of inequality, and there is a low social protection coverage, and like other regions, still a large informal sector. So in case of Asia and Pacific, you see, I think hardly 49% of the population, hardly 39% or 2/5 of population has at least one social protection coverage. more or less similar is the story for Southeast Asia. So social protection coverage is low. There is a large informal sector in Southeast Asia. You still find 280 million informal workers. And there is an estimate by the World Bank in 2020 June. They have done, I think, 3 times estimate, but the latest one was June 12. According to that estimate, 34 million could be pushed back to poverty line below $3.2 a day in East Asia and Pacific. This also includes Southeast Asia. So we are using a $3.2 a day poverty line because most countries are lower middle income country. But see, there is a possibility of, I think, 34 million people sliding back again into poverty. And the impact will be much more higher on the informal sector as well as on the informal workers. And this is, they are also not benefited from the social protection. So although there are some relief measures, but that are still temporary. So because of that reason, there is, again, since the COVID is still continuing, so this was an estimate done in June. So there will be, I think, many more who will be falling back into poverty in future if the COVID-19 continues further and further. Next slide, please. So, so now COVID-19 challenges. So we know all these point. Actually, economic growth decreases in all regions or sub-regions in 2020. Globally, we are saying that there are going to be 3 to 4% decrease in economic growth. And in case of Southeast Asia, I think there is a higher impact in Thailand, which is very much integrated in the global economy as well as global value chains. Only country, I think, which will have a positive economic growth is Vietnam. Otherwise, all countries will have a negative economic growth. But I think among the negative economic growth, the highly impacted country is Thailand, but least impacted is the Myanmar. So poverty will increase all the regions as well as in Southeast Asia, but it all depends upon the economic growth as well. So I think in case of Vietnam, it may not be that much a higher impact, but of course in Thailand, of course the income poverty $3.2 a day is very low, but below the national poverty line is still, I think, high. So it is going to impact increasing poverty in Thailand as well. Now education has been affected in all countries because there were long school closure. Mostly in the developing countries, so this has a higher impact. Now health is also affected. In the beginning, we thought that if this crisis continues only 3, 4 months, 5 months, it may not have much impact on life expectancy. Over time, it's continuing almost 9 months, more than 9 months, or almost it's going to be at least 1 year or more. So because of that reason, the morbidity has increased. Mortality has also become severe. So in that sense, there will be also impact on the life expectancy. Now the point here is that compared to yes, yeah, I'm going to finish. So compared to other sub-regions, I think Southeast Asia has a lower mortality rate, a very low rate per million population. So in that sense, still compared to South Asia or even developed countries in other regions of the world, it is still, I think, it has a low impact. So overall, I think income poverty, multidimensional poverty depends upon health, education, income, so they will be impacted in the future. So overall, SDG 1 will be impacted. Next slide, please. Now this one is, again, I borrowed a slide from OP, which was presented at the SLPF. They have seen how much will be impact on the MPI, multidimensional poverty. So they have used actually 6 scenarios, but here I'm pointing out, yes, only the modest scenario. So the first ones, you see the blue line, which shows that impact on nutrition. So if you assume that there will be an increase in malnutrition or undernutrition, not malnutrition, undernutrition by 25%, then this will eat away. Now MPI will be lost for almost half a decade. We will be pushed back 5 years. Similarly, if we take into account the education, if we think that 50% of children will be out of school from primary schooling, then in that situation, if we combine this impact with the impact of 25% undernutrition, then in that situation, the progress will be set back by 9 years or more, 9.1 years. So this is actually based on the model and estimation. and with assumptions, which may not apply for all countries, but just giving a scenario that we are going to lose a decade of progress if the COVID-19 is going to continue in case of multidimensional poverty. Next slide, please. Last slide. Now, opportunities. So, yes, there is actually, COVID has also some opportunities. With the COVID, there is increase in the investment in health sector, education sector, digital connectivity. We all know that. Because of that reason, I think there is also some sort of job creation in the health sector, primarily also in the education sector. Now, digital connectivity has been improving in many countries, but there is a lot to be done. Digital connectivity has also been used for, very much online purchases and other services, also for financial services. So this has given an opportunity, frankly speaking. We need some sort of a cooperation among the countries of the region, right? So that we can support the countries which have a very low coverage of internet connectivity, like country of Afghanistan, whereas there are other countries like even Thailand, Malaysia, and others. They have a very high coverage. So we need some sort of regional cooperation also in this sense. Similarly, this has also given an opportunity for universal social protection coverage. UN and other agencies, we are arguing for a need for universal social protection coverage, because this sort of health pandemic will be coming in the future as well. So unless there is a social protection coverage, universal, very difficult to manage the crisis. Similarly, the last one I would like to point out about this, you know that UN Secretary General has advanced this 5-pillar approach. UN as a whole, as well as government, they are looking into the SMEs, which are very much impacted, the informal workers, which are very much impacted, informal enterprises, very much impacted, because in most countries, I think their share is almost 80%. So in that sense, unless we actually support them, it's very difficult to restore the growth. So this has given a much more opportunity. COVID-19 has given some sort of push to the government, to the UN agency, to development partners, that this normal informal sector, informal workers should be paid more attention. And one of the reasons that we don't have so much data for measuring them, so they are not obvious, that this has given an opportunity to look into in detail about the impact. So bringing more attention of the government and other development partners to support this. So we can support with the digital connectivity, we can bring them into registration, formalization, although we cannot move into formalization process at the moment, but bringing them into the global value chains, linking them with the other firms and enterprises would benefit them. So thank you so much, Katinka. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Vishwa. I think you did a really great job in setting the scene and laying out for us the unprecedented social development challenges that we're facing in the sub-region due to the impacts of COVID, including some of the reversals of gains that were made in previous years with the widening inequality and the rising poverty that we're very likely to see, although, as you pointed out, we don't have the data points yet. You also emphasized some of the characteristics in the Southeast Asian region related to the very low social protection and the large informal sector, which are further impacting and contributing to these rises in inequality and poverty that we're seeing. And you also pointed out some of the opportunities. I don't want to summarize them here because I'm assuming that we will see some of the elements that you mentioned in later presentations as well. So again, thank you very much, Vishwa, for this intervention. And let's move on to our next speaker, Mr. Aziz Alberi, a senior economist at the Food and Agriculture Organization. Mr. Aziz, you have the floor, please. 10 minutes for you as well.
Yes. Good morning, Katinka. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thanks to ESCAP and the organizers for inviting me on behalf of FAO to give this very short presentation on the state of progress for SDG 2, Zero Hunger. So let me share my presentation, which I already sent to the organizers, but just in case they have a copy, in case something will happen here. So I think, can you see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much. So I will focus exclusively on SDG 2. And as you know, FAO contributes to a number of SDGs, and it's a custodian to 21 SDG indicators. but for the sake of this forum, I will focus on some of the latest assessments on the progress on SDG 2 and the zero hunger, both globally and also within the region. Broadly speaking, as FAO and other UN agencies regularly monitor the progress on malnutrition and zero hunger, and this graph, which is cumulative over a number of years, shows that the progress that has been registered over a number of years has unfortunately came to a halt in the recent years, and now the trends are going in the other direction. So we are seeing an increase in a number of malnourished or undernourished people globally, and of course, COVID did not make things better. This is a global picture, so there has been a trend upward in terms of a number of undernourished people globally. Within Asia, the trends are similar. We have two measures here, both the prevalence of severe food insecurity in total population across the different sub-regions of Asia and Pacific. As you can see in Southern Asia, the progress that has taken place over a number of years has stopped since 2016 and is going in the wrong direction since 2017. Similarly, for the Eastern Asia, even though at a lesser rate. Taken together, prevalence of moderate and severe also show a slight deterioration of these global malnutrition trends. However, the picture is not the same across the board. A study looked at the specific countries' performance vis-a-vis reducing hunger and malnutrition, and found that 19 countries, of the 19 countries, there were quite a bit of high performers countries who managed to reduce significantly their hunger levels and malnutrition levels. And this, a summary from this study reported by FAO and ZEF, shows the positive trend for 19 countries who have achieved substantial progress in reducing hunger over the period of 2000-2017, whereas the least performance, unfortunately, have seen a rise in hunger and malnutrition. I listed on the table to the right an example of countries from our region who are among the good performers who managed to reduce the prevalence of undernutrition from 2001 to 2018 in a significant rate. The COVID itself this year also has had a negative impact, as would be expected. FAO, WHO, WFP, and IFAD and UNICEF common report on food insecurity for 2020 did a special analysis on the added impact of COVID on malnutrition indicators. And this study, which basically used scenarios following the projections of growth projections from IMF, showed that in addition to the 690 million, which were reported to be undernourished in 2019, COVID alone will add another 83 to 132 million more undernourished in 2020, and for the specific criteria of acute malnutrition of children, we would add another 6.7 million. So definitely at the global level, the COVID has had an added negative impact on the overall picture for malnutrition. there was a study to look at what would it take in terms of investment going forward toward 2030 to reverse this trend and to actually achieve the the SDG goals. This study basically used the marginal cost curve approach and looked at a number of different investment options and looked at two criteria. One is the first one is to meet the G7 commitment to lift 500 million people out of malnutrition by 2030. That would require an incremental investment, annual investment at the global level between 11 and 14 billion. And if we would be more ambitious and aim to completely go to zero hunger by 2030, the estimated aggregate investment would be between 40 to 50 billion annually at the global level. Obviously, the number of critical investments and interventions are numerous and need to be implemented in a sequential and an appropriate way, of course tailored toward different countries. But the most important one are listed at the bottom of this table, obviously affecting several sectors from health, food, education, social protection, as well as economic policies. Within agriculture and the food sector itself, research and development is still key, as well as agricultural extension services and the digitalization and the innovations that are for which so much promise is being held, as well as other traditional investments in irrigation and female literacy improvement, which is shown to be critically important in reducing household malnutrition. To wrap up, obviously FAO overall programs contribute to many SDGs beside SDG 2. We are currently in the process of revising our strategic program to be more aligned with SDGs. These strategic programs is basically built around four goals: better production, food production and availability, better nutrition, better environment, and better livelihoods. And of course, there are specific programs within these four overall goals to reach the overall FAO vision, which is, of course, to focus on a world free of hunger and malnutrition, and also a world where there is social inclusion and poverty reduction, as well as managing the environment sustainably. In the new strategic framework, FAO is developing currently a particular focus will be given to three SDGs, SDG 1 and SDG 2, which is our traditional area, as well as SDG 10 to reduce inequalities and social programs. So to wrap up, because of a short amount of time, we in the context of SDG 2, the trends of global as well as Asian region with respect to hunger and malnutrition indicators have seen a reversal to the progress that took place in the recent years. And that reversal started in 2017 and is continuing. Many countries, including in Asia, have demonstrated progress, so that decline is not uniform. There are some champions and good performers, and there are some countries who haven't done as well. The COVID-19 pandemic has aggravated the situation, as was estimated preliminarily, with respect to the food security situation. In terms of action, in terms of commitments to investment, it is estimated that it will take between 11 to 14 billion US dollars annually to reduce the number of hunger people by 500 million by 2030, or if we are fully ambitious to zero hunger, that's between 40 to 50 billion annually, as was estimated in the recent study. And finally, FAO work program is being redesigned to be more aligned with SDGs, giving specific attention to SDG 1, 2, and SDG 10. And of course, we contribute to the other ones as well. With that, Katinka, I'll stop and I'll be happy to entertain any questions as they may arrive. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Aziz, for this presentation, which really very nicely linked to the previous one, right? Where Bishwa had reminded us on the long-term impacts of poor nutrition of children, and your presentation showed that this is a very slow in progress that we've actually already been seeing for a couple of years, and that it's very likely to continue under the current COVID situation. And that can really only be addressed adequately if we invest sufficiently, invest in resilient food systems, in nutrition-sensitive food diversification, into the appropriate use of technologies, focusing especially on ICTs. And that goes hand in hand, of course, with investment into agriculture, research, development, extension. But your presentation also emphasized again that it is very important to take a broader view and to include elements such as social protection, literacy of women, and other aspects. So thank you very much for this. I hope we'll have opportunities for questions and answers later on. But at this point in time, let us move on to Mr. Fu Hin, the technical specialist on employment and decent work in the regional office in Asia and the Pacific of ILO, the International Labour Organization. Mr. Fu Hin, you have 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Katinka. Can you hear me okay?
Excellent. And the presentation is also online.
Great. Thank you very much. Can we go ahead and move to the first slide? Thank you. Thank you very much again. This presentation is going to be very brief, and we'll be talking specifically on Sustainable Development Goal 8, which is obviously economic growth and decent work. But given the complexity of that goal within itself, we're going to focus more on the decent work aspects of it. And then touching on some of the current trends and challenges that we see taking place within the region, specific obviously to what's happening with COVID-19. And then trying to wrap it up with some of the key priority areas that we want to focus on in terms of not only addressing the current crisis and the immediate recovery, but how we get that momentum going again towards the 2030 agenda. Okay. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So when we talk about SDG 8, again, it's a very complicated SDG because it talks about sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, as well as full and productive employment and decent work for all. On the issue of economic growth, I won't spend too much time on this. My colleague Bishwa really touched on some of these issues already in the first presentation. But some of the issues that I think oftentimes really stand out here in the region, though, are the issues of inclusive growth, whether it's been equitable, as well as whether it's been sustainable in terms of the environmental ramifications of the production means that we've been seeing in the region. But in terms of decent work, this is an issue that is obviously integrated with economic growth because it's the one sustainable means for boosting economies. And the idea of decent work is that we're not talking about just the number of jobs or just the pure level of employment, but also whether or not these jobs are productive, whether they're well paid, whether they provide a certain level of social protection, whether or not they respect labor rights, they allow for collective bargaining, whether or not they allow for freedom of association. And again, this important issue of whether there's dialogue in the process, making sure that workers and employers are engaged in the policy process of ensuring that policies that affect the world of work are also consulted upon. In relation to this, again, decent work is integrated in a number of the SDGs. You heard some of it already raised before in SDG 1 on poverty. Clearly, there's a link with education and training, SDG 4, with gender and 5, as well as when you think about inequality and inclusive economies, SDG 10. But this one here, again, we'll try to focus on SDG 8 given the limitations we have in time. Next slide, please. So the first SDG I wanted to raise here was 821 on productivity. So what we've seen over the last couple of decades is steady growth in labor productivity. And this has been driven by structural change in the economies, reallocation of workers moving into higher value added sectors. And this has been driven by trade, obviously, but it's also been a driver itself in terms of significant reductions in poverty throughout the region. But the issue remains, though, is that overall we have significant gaps within the region as a whole. You can see there's wide variances across the different countries in the region. For the region as a whole, we're looking at a level of about 10,000 US dollars in constant terms. And this is a major concern, obviously, now with COVID-19. We don't have the data yet to know exactly what will be the impact, but with the slowdown in investment and trade, the erosion of human capital, the slowdown of structural transformation, we expect this indicator to either stagnate or even regress during the next during this period during the COVID crisis. Next slide, please. Again, as my colleague Bishwa talked earlier about the issue of informality, this is still a major issue in Southeast Asia. We estimate that around 3 of every 4 workers in the region are informally employed. This amounts to more than 225 million workers. This is a major concern because obviously these workers will lack pensions, unemployment benefits, medical leave, maternity leave. Their jobs are often low paid, insecure, and very precarious. And it's also becoming very prominent during this period of the COVID crisis because you see that in a lot of countries, the policy options that policymakers have are limited because of the fact that they don't have the formal institutions or mechanisms to reach out and support a lot of these informal workers. So they're limited in that regard as well. Next slide, please. SDG 8 is specifically 8.5. One looks at wages and earnings, and specifically with the idea or the principle of promoting equal pay for work of equal value. This is fundamental to decent work, the principle of non-discrimination. And if we look at the gender pay gap within the region, we still see that there are significant gaps in some countries. While there's been some progress in certain countries and there's been certain levels of parity, we still see that overall there's a general gender pay gap of around 10 to 20% in which women earn less than men. And if you dig a little bit deeper, if you were to look at this by occupation, you oftentimes see that these numbers overall are sometimes skewed by the fact that women may be concentrated in some of the higher paying jobs, but overall in the bulk of the occupations that they're working in, they're actually earning a lot less than men. So this is a major challenge that we see, and it's a persistent challenge that we continue to see throughout the region. Next slide, please. Looking at indicator 8.61, this is looking at young people who are not in education, employment, or training. This is an important indicator to track because it helps us get a sense of the decent work opportunities for young people, and also whether or not they are engaged in opportunities that are helping them develop themselves and their human capital for the future opportunities in the labor market. Now for the region as a whole, we see around 1 in 5 or around 20% of young people who are not in education, employment, or training. Again, this represents a huge loss to society in terms of where we're heading in the future and you know what resources we will have in terms of tapping into this potential that young people bring. And there's another thing that really stands out in the region is that in every country, regardless of the level of this indicator, we see that women tend to have higher rates than men. Young women have higher rates than young men. So there's clearly something happening there in terms of societal norms, discrimination that are preventing women from accessing employment, even accessing education and training at the same rates that young men are able to. Again, we don't have the data yet for what this will mean in the COVID-19 crisis, but our expectations are that it will probably worsen. We have seen in the past crises that young people are oftentimes the first ones to be retrenched from their job because of a lack of seniority or experience. And there's already existing evidence coming out showing that while some education and training systems in the region have been able to move into online platforms, overall, there's been a disparity in that regard, and that online learning has not been accessible to all. So we're seeing more and more situations, anecdotal evidence of young people who are now falling out of the education and training opportunities that they would have if not for COVID-19. Next slide, please. So again, we don't have a lot of data yet to quantify precisely what is the impact of COVID-19, but overall our expectation is that the crisis is exacerbating SDG challenges in relation to decent work in this region. If you look at just SDG 8.1 on economic GDP per capita growth, the latest IMF forecast for the region as a whole looks at a contraction of around 4.3% this year alone. The ILO, looking specifically at the labor market, we've been trying to look at the number of hours lost, the working hours lost because of stay-at-home containment requirements, lockdown measures, whether or not people have been losing their jobs as a result of the crisis, and then translating this into a quantifiable number in terms of jobs that would have been lost, in terms of converting those working hours into full-time employment jobs lost. And what we see for the region as a whole, between the second and third quarters of this year, there's been an estimated 78 million jobs that have been lost already, which is a very substantial number. And related to this, we are seeing a decrease in earnings for this region alone since the beginning of this year. There's been a loss of an estimated $105 billion US, which is about 4.5% GDP for the region as a whole. Next slide, please. To wrap up, I just wanted to touch upon some of the key priority areas and how we might want to look at this crisis and turn it into opportunities for moving ahead, and how we sustain this effort towards not only a sustainable recovery, but also, again, looking at the 2030 agenda and not losing sight of those goals that have been established. So the first issue is the critical need, not only now, but even possibly in the next year or so, of sustaining fiscal policies to stimulate the economy and employment. This is critical to boost consumption and stem job losses. We have seen a number of countries implement measures such as social assistance through cash transfers. We've also seen wage subsidies and special loans that have been issued. And this is important to keep in mind, that to not scale back these fiscal policy responses too soon, and to make sure that the economy is strong, sustainable, going beyond this year. This also creates an opportunity for thinking about a new normal, a new and better normal. And this is something that was alluded to earlier. The idea that the crisis presents an opportunity to think about skills for the future, to think about green initiatives and green jobs, as well as universal social protection. Secondly, it's important to think about vulnerable enterprises and workers. Again, this needs to be country specific, but for a lot of countries in the Southeast Asia region, this means specifically looking at a lot of informal enterprises, particularly the small, medium, and medium enterprises, and particularly vulnerable workers, migrants, women, young people, and particularly those working in sectors that have been extremely hard hit, such as tourism and export manufacturing. Third, it's again important, not only for the crisis, but beyond this period, to think about really strengthening our labor market institutions. This again goes back to the issues of labor legislation and ensuring rights at work, industrial relations, and making sure we have strong wage setting mechanisms. Fourth, making sure that our policy processes are inclusive. And this starts first, inclusive consultation within government, both at the horizontal and vertical level, as well as with stakeholders outside of government. And this is an important time to really note the importance of supporting workers and employers organizations and social dialogue in that process. And finally, I just wanted to touch on a critical point that this is really echoing a point that was raised in the first presentation, which is that we still have significant SDG 8 data gaps, and it prevents us to really monitor the progress that we want to move towards. This for SDG 8, this is a significant gap that we see in terms of measuring labor rights, migrant workers, child labor, and forced labor. Let me stop there. Thank you very much. And of course, I'd be happy to engage further in the discussion. Let me turn it back to you, Kantika. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, for staying in time, but also for, I think, providing us with these really sobering statistics at sub-regional level in respect to the impact that we're seeing due to COVID. You mentioned especially economic contraction, the impact in the terms of working hours lost, and the decrease in earnings, which go into the billions, as we see from your data. But you also presented some opportunities that the pandemic could provide in terms of thinking about skills for the future, green jobs in particular. But I think also something that Bishwa in his presentation had mentioned around really thinking of how we can bring the informal sector and formalize that more to ensure that governments can target their policies in a more stringent way. Okay, thank you very much for this. We are now moving on to my next speaker. Oh yes, my next speaker is Mr. Mushtaq Memon, who's here in the room with us, the Regional Coordinator for Resource Efficiency and the Asia Pacific Regional Office from the United Nations Environment Program, who will speak on SDG 12. Mushtaq, the floor is yours, please. 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Katinka. And so let me go through the SDG 12 discussions, because we have seen that recently, even in the SCAP report, that SDG 12 is regressing. So I'll be briefly touching on that, how much the truth is there, and then what is required to be done to implement further on the SDG 12, and more importantly on reporting, because the regression is based on the reporting, and that may not covering the full implementation as well. So looking on these three aspects. So when we are talking about the SDG 12, responsible consumption and production, we have to really look, because this covers everything, like from the products, from the food, from services, and so on. So basically, when we are talking about the production and the consumption, it covers everything, whatever we do in our daily lives and so on. And also then there are the indicators which are helping to go for the responsible or sustainable consumption and production, including the green public procurement, sustainable lifestyles, and sustainable tourism, and so on. So that's where we will look into that how this is really happening in Asia. So the important point for pushing the production levels or the consumption levels is again the economic activities. So as we have seen, the economic growth in Asia in the recent years was enormous. And then that has led to create more like a middle income class, which is basically have a lot of a disposable income to push further the consumption levels. And so this is one of the key points to be that unless we have a proper regulations, incentives, disincentive mechanisms, that those consumption levels will go up. So because the externalities are not accounted for yet in many areas, even with the plastics packaging, even with the cars, even with the food and so on. So that because the externalities are not there, so the full price is not for the consumers and also for the producers. So when we talk about the polluter pay principle, that's like the producers and the consumers, they do not really bear the full price of their consumption and production levels. So that's the starting point to look on that. And because of that challenge, what we have seen when we are talking about 1.5 degrees, again, this whole goes with the consumption and production, that if we cannot integrate or internalize the externalities, this will again be a challenge. Whether we look on the marine issues or marine litter, again, when we are looking on that plastics and packaging, that we cannot transferring the full cost to the consumers or the producers is not going to happen. So when we talk about the ideal scenario, that what we intact in terms of production requirements like minerals, biomass, and so on, to produce the products or services, and then go to the consumer level and what is happening in the consumption and what is happening at the end of life in terms of waste and so on, and also waste and pollution being generated in the whole life cycle process, from even the extraction of the resources to the transportation to the production to the consumption, and also end of life like waste and so on. So when we are looking on this whole life cycle, then we can easily see that what are the challenges, that why there's a pollution, why there's not like optimization or resource efficiency in production systems, in consumption systems, and why they are like a pollution at each level. Again, because of the externalities are not really accounted for in Asia Pacific region in many countries. And so for coming to the circular economy or creating the circularity in the system, so on the one hand, we reduce the impact of the resources for achieving same quality of life in terms of products and services, and on the other hand, the footprints like pollution and waste. So if we want to address these both, we have to look on the circularity, that we need to, on the one hand, to increase the efficiency of the resources, either through the longevity of the product lives, or also in terms of sharing, that one product like car share can help to the more consumers or customers, and also in terms of green supply chain, that means bringing back to the all the waste back into the system rather than relying on the virgin resources and so on. So in that context, if we look on the assessments, like under the Switch Asia is a EU-funded project. That's a huge project to mainstream sustainable consumption and production in Asia Pacific. So we have a regional policy advocacy component under the United Nations Environment Program of that project, where we conducted this SDG 12 assessment, because we are supporting many countries on reporting on the SDG 12. So to do that, we have to look at where are the challenges on the reporting side, but also on the implementation side. So basically, this some of the slides are based from that work. So when we are looking on these indicators, because we have on the one hand, we have a downstream type of indicators like a resource efficiency, like 12.1, 12.2 is 10 YFP, but 12.1 and 12.3 is a food, and 12.4, again, the waste and recycling, and 12.5 hazardous waste, 12.6 is a sustainability reporting, then 12.7 is a green public procurement, and 12.8 is a sustainable lifestyles. Then we have a 12.A, B, C on sustainable tourism and so on. So basically, we have a set of like indicators which cover the full life cycle of the products and services and how we consume, like green public procurement or sustainable lifestyles and so on, and in different sectors. So this, when we are looking on these numbers, that how are in the countries where we conducted this assessment, where do they stand in terms of reporting on those one, then we have seen that on 12.1, it's quite a good number, but more important also came on the recycling and so on the 12.4. And then also sustainable lifestyles, green public procurement, they are picking up quite fast. And then we have a quite a detailed analysis of the indicators from each, the countries we also work with, that on the 12.1, which countries are leading, and then on 12.2, 10 YFP and so on, then same with the 12.3 on the food waste and food loss and so forth. So the point here is that basically when we look on the countries how they are reporting, now they are the national government. So suppose Ministry of Environment could be the responsible ministry for reporting, but then this implementation is spread across the different ministries, including suppose Ministry of Agriculture or Food on the 12.3, it is spread on the Ministry of Industries, and so on. So when we look on these structures, that how the reporting is happening and implementation is also happening and so on, it is quite different in different countries, and also it's not very much still aligned, despite of we already are this SDGs in the 2015, so we are already in 20, more than 5 years. So on the one hand, the indicators are being also still developed from like a tier 3 to tier 2 and so on for the reporting. But more important also how the reporting systems in the countries are working. That's not yet like a fully operational to the level that we can get monitoring very well, and same goes to the implementation. And then also in many countries, because the government systems are quite like decentralized, like a city level, provincial level, and so on. So again, those linkages are not strongly yet established on the reporting side. So I will not go through reading all this, and it's a small, the report is available, but just to give you examples that how in-depth work or support we have been providing also through the UNCTs and also through our colleagues in UNSCAP with the statistical branch and so on. So my point is to attract your kind attention to see that what support you need from us to help you to establish the reporting systems on SDG 12 and also the implementation capacity, but more important to see your analysis within your countries that how to make the reporting effective on SDG 12, because we see the regression, which is not really a true picture to many extent, because we have seen quite a bit of work even on the plastics and packaging before the COVID was enormous, like many countries already started banning, started charging and so on. Same went to the food loss and food waste. And there's a lot on the green public procurement happening, even like in many countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, Thailand, and so on. So what I would like to conclude my presentation is that reporting on SDG 12 in the region is lagging behind, giving not the realistic picture of the efforts and the progress made in the region. So really important that whether it's a VNR, whether there's any other reporting forms, we have to be really, really active, and we are here to help, but it goes to the governments and at even subnational and city level to do so. And then in order to improve the implementation and get the international recognition, countries should report both to the global indicator framework and in their voluntary national reviews. So again, there are different levels of reporting. So some countries are good at VNR, some are good in indicators. So we have to have a uniformity in bringing the countries to all the reporting levels. And there's a need to integrate the reporting mechanisms in the countries. So sometimes indicator reporting is one place and VNRs are in other places and so on. And then also the representation in the Asia Pacific Forum on the Sustainable Development run by SCAP, a high-level political forum in New York. So how this reporting and everything is happening, how the governments, how they're representatives, like in New York, coming from the UN missions, and then also the direct, so their ministries like environment involved, and then the Ministry of Finance, Ministry of Foreign Affairs is representing. So how the linkages are there, that's very important to look into that. Then some of the targets are well tackled and there's improved reporting while the other targets are lagging behind. So we have to also move to the targets, especially which are lagging behind. And as I say, like a hazardous waste, for example, is lagging behind, that we have to really address that one and so on. So then mechanism, that is a global monitoring initiatives and national governments, hence consistency in reporting is key for accurate monitoring. So we have seen that some countries get very excited and to do the reporting in 1 year, but then in the next year, they're lagging behind the same excitement. So how to really have a consistency on that. And then reporting on data measures and sensitivized for need, agreed upon methods, increase the compatibility of data and time. Now, this is also the technical level. So the technical capacity in the countries is very important. How the different institutions, universities, experts are aligned to really bring that technical capacity within the countries is there. as national statistical systems are at the core of robust monitoring systems, and so we have to make them relevant, especially through our SCAP's statistical branch and so on. Then finally, stakeholders should ensure that national, regional, and global monitoring processes are harmonized across the different levels of government, different levels of even the stakeholders like the private sector, industries like sustainability reporting on 12.6, for example, from the industries and so forth. And this particularly relevant to the context of the VNRs, which are vital to follow up and review processes within the UN systems. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mushtaq. Yeah, as you had pointed out, per capita consumption in the Asia-Pacific region has been increasing over previous years. The material footprint per unit of GDP is very high in this region, twice as intensive as the world average. What impact the COVID crisis will have on this consumption, both in terms of incomes and how incomes and declining incomes impact consumption, but on the other side, the increasing use of plastic waste, of which we have anecdotal evidence, right, because of our drive to use single-use plastics during the pandemic, medical waste. You had spoken about waste. All of our knowledge on all of these will depend on having a good reporting system in place. So thank you very much for reminding us and for reminding our member states how important it is to really put these measures and these systems in place so that we have a good understanding of what is happening and where the flow of products is going to. Well, thank you very much again, Mushtaq. And I would now like to turn to our last speaker in this round, Ms. Tess Björk. Tess is a human rights officer in the Southeast Asia Regional Office in the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and will speak on SDG 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. Tess, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. I hope you can all hear me. I'm first going to try to put on the presentation.
We can hear and see you.
Okay, so for the next few minutes, I would like to discuss why lack of progress on SDG 16 jeopardizes or can jeopardize the achievement of the 2030 agenda as a whole in Asia and the Pacific. Hold on, let me see how I don't seem to be able to change slides.
The slide is not moving on this side either.
I'm trying to put up it again, but if it doesn't work, perhaps you can, okay, yeah, it's moving now. Okay, so first let's look at SDG 16. It has 12 targets and 23 indicators, and it's covering a wide range of issues from violence, access to information, effective institutions, participation, corruption, and non-discrimination, just to mention a few. While all SDGs to some extent are interdependent, SDG 16 is sometimes referred to as an accelerator or enabler SDG. And several VNR reports from this region also recognize SDG 16 as critical to sustainable development. Thailand, for example, described SDG 16 as the golden thread that weaves through all SDGs. SDG 16 is even the main theme of the report in Timor-Leste, as it is a catalyst for sustainable development. Indonesia notes that despite progress on SDGs in health, education, and decent work, aggregate progress hides inequalities as efforts have not succeeded in reaching the most vulnerable populations. And the solution to this, according to the government, lies in SDG 16, and the government notes that all sectors must apply an SDG 16 lens. So to illustrate and give some examples of what this means, I think we can all agree that, for example, effective institutions and legal identity are key to delivering social services and social protection. Corruption undermines economic growth, and whether we're combating environmental degradation or ensuring decent work, we need effective institutions, access to information, accountability, and the rule of law. So what does the current situation in Southeast Asia look like when it comes to SDG 16? This graph is using data from the ESCAP SDG Data Explorer, and there are two obvious conclusions from this. The first is that there seems to be an alarming regressive trend, but secondly, we have very, very little data about the situation. So I've tried to find more data to complement the pictures. And from my colleagues in Geneva, as the OECHR is the custodian of some indicators under SDG 16, I received information on 3 additional indicators. And here we can see that the cases of verified killings of human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists have gone up. Likewise, the verified cases of enforced disappearance have also gone up, but we have to note that there is a significant data gap on these indicators, in particular on this one. And for quite a few countries, we don't really have any data at all. On a more positive note, we see a positive trend in terms of how many countries that have an independent national human rights institution. So on this indicator, Southeast Asia is actually approaching the global average. In my search for more data on SDG 16, I next looked at the VNR reports from the region that have already been presented so far. However, very few contain data and additional information on the status of SDG 16. When they do contain data, it's usually not disaggregated and does not allow for a leave no one behind analysis. There are some exceptions to this. Vietnam and Philippines, for example, contain data in relation to some indicators. Indonesia has integrated data from various domestic and international sources, and they outline trends over time, acknowledging that on many indicators, they're actually the trend is negative. They're frankly acknowledging these challenges and how they plan to address them, and they're using a mix of national and international data. So while most of the data in the Indonesia report is not disaggregated by groups, the report in some instances highlight particular vulnerabilities that, of groups that are left behind, such as, for example, birth certificates are lacking in particular for children in bottom 40 families, and also for children in Papua and West Papua. So what does this mean? We can conclude so far that SDG 16 is critical for achieving the whole 2030 agenda. Yet, we lack the data to measure implementation and exactly know where we are. The data we have so far, though, does show a negative trend. That was the situation by the end of 2019. So the question is, how has COVID-19 impacted on this? So we don't have exact data on all of the SDG 16 indicators, but we do have some information, and I'll go through some of this. For example, while there was a brief respite from conflict at the beginning of the pandemic in some countries, recently those conflicts have returned because the underlying causes remain unresolved. Some conflicts also continued uninterrupted and even intensified during COVID. We've seen calls to helpline support services and shelters indicate that domestic violence has increased during lockdown, while some countries took steps to reduce the risk of spreading the virus through prison populations, for example, through prisoner release and limiting pretrial detention. The introduction of emergency measures have also resulted in increased use of detention for violation of emergency measures. As highlighted by UNODC report, one of my UN sister agencies, COVID has presented additional risks for corruption. For example, most countries have used cash payments, grants, tax rebates, and loans to disperse emergency funds, often without anti-corruption safeguards. And the need to urgently purchase medical equipment also presents risks in this regard. Emergency measures introduced in some countries have established new decision-making structures, and these often raise concerns for participation and transparency. We've also seen in this region, as globally, very few women in pandemic decision-making. In terms of global governance, we want to closely monitor the equitable distribution of vaccines and ensure that countries in this region and the most vulnerable population groups get early access to vaccines. The emergency measures introduced These emergency measures have introduced a range of restrictions on fundamental freedoms, including peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. And these are areas where countries in Southeast Asia rank low already before COVID. This is problematic since we saw very early on in China how critical access to information and freedom of expression is in a public health crisis. Recent community perception surveys point to significant problems with stigmatization, with almost half of respondents from countries in this region believing that a specific group, often migrants or ethnic minorities, are at fault for spreading the virus in their country. We've also seen an increase in hate speech. On a positive note, however, some national human rights institutions have played a proactive role, in particular in regard to minorities, and raised concerns about the rise in racism and xenophobia. So to conclude on COVID, COVID has exposed many of the pre-existing vulnerabilities and challenges in relation to SDG 16. Some indicators are also likely to have been impacted negatively. And this is, of course, very worrying if we are to achieve the overall 2030 agenda. So how can we step up implementation reporting on SDG 16? First of all, what matters is whether we can reach the SDGs, not how well we report on it, but, and now I'd like to quote the Indonesia VNR report from 2020, what can be measured can be done. And the report also noted that what is not measured, and those who are not measured are those and what will be left behind. So in essence, we need to know where we are, and we need to know what the challenges are in order to decide how we get to 2030. This means that we need to collect more data, better data, and we need to better use the data that we have. So in addition to domestic official data, you can also use various other information sources, including international data. Some UN agencies have data here that you can use. Quantitative data is good, but often it needs to be complemented by qualitative information. We need a much stronger LNB analysis and efforts. This is quite striking in terms of SDG 16 to see the lack of LNB analysis. Disaggregation of data will go a long way, but there are also complementary methods to identify and engage with LNB groups. And I'd like to quickly show you a tool that can be helpful for you in terms of assessing the situation, what action to take, and groups that are left behind, both for SDG 16 and other SDGs. So I'm sorry I couldn't fit it the whole screen in one page here. What you will see here is the Universal Human Rights Index. And this is a search tool where you can search by SDG or indicator, and it will generate all the recommendations that have been given to a particular country from international human rights mechanisms. So the example in the slide, for example, is for one country in this region, and it shows that there are 815 observations and recommendations only in relation to SDG 16. Of the reports in the region, I'd like to highlight Timor-Leste as the country who actually used recommendations from international human rights mechanisms in its VNR report. So other ways we can step up implementation reporting on SDG 16 include to ensure meaningful, safe, and effective participation. Many of the speakers before me have highlighted that this is critical for all SDGs, but the essence of participation, which includes, for example, access to information and freedom of expression and assembly, are part of the SDG indicators. So this is really at the heart of SDG 16. Participation is also a way to collect information where you lack data, to identify which are the groups behind, to more accurately and innovatively find ways to accelerate progress. So do focus on effective participation. I think that's a strong recommendation from many speakers over these two days. Also remember, the VNR is not a competition in looking good. It is an opportunity to reflect on where we are, what has worked well, and what the challenges are. Use that opportunity. Share experiences and learn from each other. There are several coalitions of governments and other stakeholders which focus on both reporting and implementation specifically on SDG 16. And I believe all the presentations will be shared, so you will find here links to 3 of such coalitions. Indonesia and Timor-Leste are part of some of these coalitions, which is perhaps also why their VNR reports are a bit richer in terms of reporting on SDG 16. So finally, I'd like to re-emphasize a point made yesterday by the resident coordinator of Timor-Leste. Countries report on dimensions of sustainable development to various bodies. not only the VNR. Use this to your advantage. Aim for synergies with other reporting obligations, for example, to the Universal Periodic Review or to other international mechanisms. Timor-Leste and Thailand have already expressed in their last VNR reports that they are aiming to do exactly that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tess, for this presentation. You showed that the region, the sub-region, I think both the region and the sub-region, still have a very long way to go to achieve the SDG 16 targets with limited improvement, especially on the rule of law. But I really like that overview that you provided in showing how different targets under the SDGs, under SDG 16 could be impacted through COVID-19. I think that provided for a really good framework of how to think about the potential impacts of COVID-19 on SDG 16, which, as you pointed out, is really a backbone of the 2030 agenda and perhaps even an accelerator SDG. I think what came out really clearly is the importance to ensure accountability, accessibility and transparency. And there are different ways of doing that. I think you spoke to it quite some lengths around the institutionalization of engagement and participation and the value that brings. You also spoke a lot to data and statistics and the opportunities that present themselves by making more information available about all groups in society, including those left behind. So really, thank you very much for this presentation. We now have around 30 minutes for questions and answers. I'm looking into the chat box. Please post your questions into the chat. And as we wait for participants to raise their questions, I wondered whether perhaps each of the 5 presenters could very briefly provide 1 or 2 examples, also considering the wide breadth of presentations that we've heard, on key leverage points that you think are important to make further progress on the respective goal that you represent. Anybody who would like to go first?
Can you repeat the question again?
If you could provide 1 or 2 key leverage points that would help to overcome some of the key challenges that you've presented in respect to the respective goals that you're talking about, that you're representing in the session. And thinking across the different goals as we're talking about the interlinkages and an integration of the 2030 agenda.
Katinka, can I speak?
Yes, please. Vishwa.
Thank you so much. I don't know whether I correctly understood. I think, yes, Tess already pointed out that goal 16 is an integrator, frankly speaking. It is an accelerator. It can help to also achieve the other goals. So similarly, in that sense, I think if we are talking about the COVID-19 and how to address the impact, how to restore the economic growth, how to address the poverty issue, which I presented. Frankly speaking, we see social protection is an important area. It could serve as a great leverage to reduce the impact of COVID-19 in various ways. You know, each shock, I think it has impact, but as we know, I think shock depends upon coping capacity, and yes, our adaptive capacity as well as exposure to shock. So yes, I think COVID-19 is impacting everyone, but the impact varies between the countries or population groups. Those who are more vulnerable, lacking the adaptive capacity, like earlier we mentioned, in case of in a country, if there are informal workers, they are not getting social protection or may not be listed, I think, for getting even the relief, government relief or support measures. So those will be, I think, more impacted. So bringing the informal sector into the loop, as well as improving the social protection system, is one area of important concern. The second one is digital connectivity, which is very much necessary for addressing the impact of COVID-19, so that I think in developing countries, also those who are not able to go to school or colleges, they can also join online or can operate their business. So that is another area. But important point here is that I think developing countries, a poor country, they are lacking also fiscal space. They already spend millions of dollars on these relief measures. And in view of decreasing economic growth, and also difficult in raising taxes, mobilizing resources, domestic finance, the only option seems to be at the moment is either, debt cancellation from the developed countries or some more support from the other development partners in these developing countries. Or there is a need for, I think, support from the better off countries to the poorer countries. That means there is a need for a regional cooperation. So earlier, I think I wanted to point out, in order to improve the digital connectivity, which is a public good, frankly speaking, there is a need for enhanced regional cooperation in this area. There are countries which have a better connectivity, whereas there are countries which have very least connectivity, frankly speaking, like case of Afghanistan. Even if there is a connection, it's not at the access of the poor, or it's very expensive. So ways and means need to be developed to invest in the public goods like digital connectivity, which are actually, there is under provision of these goods in order to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. So 2 points I mentioned. One is social protection, another one digital connectivity. And there are, of course, many more others. But over to you, Katinka. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Vishwa, for bringing these points to our attention. I see Fu from ILO who has raised his hand, and then Aziz after that.
Thank you, Katinka. I also wanted to talk about a bit on informality and related to specific to social protection, but since Bishwa already covered that quite well, I just wanted to then make the point about participation and specifically about making sure that these policy processes are consultative and ensuring that the proper stakeholders are engaged in this process. I think that especially when fiscal capacities are constrained in this COVID-19 context, it's important that policies are considered from a distributional perspective to make sure that the impact of these policies and how it will impact on different segments of society is considered. And it's important to make sure we have voices of people who are going to be impacted by these policies engaged in that process. So again, in the labor sphere, obviously, we're talking about employers organizations. We're talking about workers organizations, NGOs and CSOs that represent informal workers. It's really important to make sure that their voices are heard and that they are engaged and represented in this process. And related to that is also making sure that the different partners and stakeholders in this process have information and evidence and have data-driven evidence that can help guide that policy process. Without that, we're basically debating and engaging in a process where it's basically driven by what people individually may want, but we don't see the bigger picture in terms of how this may affect and improve our position towards these SDGs and our development goals as a whole. So making sure that these processes of engagement and consultation are informed by evidence. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Aziz?
Okay, thank you, Katinka, for giving me the floor. I would like to elaborate a little further on the connection between SDG 2 on malnutrition and hunger and its connection with SDG 1 on poverty. And FAO has been focusing in since the new Director General came on board to focus on those least developed countries, landlocked countries, more vulnerable areas within those countries, where we have a combination of poverty and malnutrition, but at the same time a potential for local economic growth, rural revitalization. So combining these social protection, which is now being referred to regularly, and safety net, with basically developing the rural economy and income and job and enterprise opportunities for small-scale producers, for SMEs, for youth. Combining the two is really the way forward to ensure that these SDGs are implemented at the local level or the subnational level, and doing so with the aim of a scale, bringing different partners, both development partners, but also private sector players, and in close coordination with governments, both local and national. So FAO is working along this initiative that it's called Hand in Hand Initiative, but it's an integrated rural development program at the subnational level, combining both social safety, social protection for the most vulnerable on an immediate basis with initiatives and investments to promote, value addition, to promote value chain development, non-farm activities. And here, of course, the role of digital innovations and technology is certainly an accelerator. So we are actually working in this framework on a number of countries globally, but within the region, where we see the need to push for implementing at the local level the interventions at scale with different partners and different synergies that will enable us to progress on both SDG 2, but also its related critical SDG 1 on poverty. So this in my view is one way we are moving from just monitoring progress to actually trying to help change on the ground with, of course, other partners, both within the UN, IFIs, but also private sector and local governments and other stakeholders. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks much, Aziz. And Tess, over to you.
Thanks. The first point I wanted to make has already been raised. I'd like to again re-emphasize participation, but I'll do it briefly anyway, because I do think this is really important, because it's both a means and a process and a goal in itself. It's an objective that we want to reach. So participation is important not only when we develop the VNR report, for example, but it's something we want to have in all development processes in a country. And what is in particular difficult and where it requires an extra effort is to make sure that we consult also with the groups that are particularly left behind. So there is a lot of what we do sometimes when we ask for participation is we share information and we take information sharing as the same thing as participation, and it's actually not. The Human Rights Council has adopted guidelines on what it means to have meaningful, effective participation that I'd be happy to share with the organizers. That can actually be, it's quite step by step. So I think it's something that can be quite useful for countries in terms of how to do this in a very meaningful way. I think it's also important to acknowledge bottlenecks and challenges and why progress isn't fast enough, and reflect on why it's not working. What can we really do different, and not just trying to, it's important that we focus on what works well, but if we want to accelerate progress, we really need to take a good look in the mirror on what's not working. If I'm going to choose two indicators, in no way saying that they are more important than the others under SDG 16, but I do think that they are very important for this region and for the rest of the 2030 agenda. I think it's important to look at, for example, responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision making and institutions, because these institutions are the fundamentals for delivering a lot of the things that we have in the 2030 agenda, and also for ensuring accountability. The other thing I think it's important to look at, and that's become very, very obvious since COVID, is non-discriminatory laws and policies. Most of the time, the problem is not so much that the laws and policies are not there, but we need to implement them and we need to hold those who violate them accountable. But there is also another side. We need to work on, for example, discriminatory attitudes. And this is important not for justice and fairness, but if we are to have a social contract in a country, if we genuinely are to deliver on the 2030 agenda together as a country, this is really critical, and it has shown to be a problem in some countries in the region. Thank you.
Thanks, Tess. Mr.
Thank you, Karinka. Okay, so let me put an example from SDG 12. Let's take 12.3, food waste and food loss. Now, that's connected, whole SDG 12 is connected with all the SDGs, but let's take this example. So on the food, how the food is produced, how the food is, as I mentioned, transported, and how the food is being sold, how the food is being consumed, and how the discarded at the end of time, life, and also while in the production, to the transportation, to the wholesaler retailing, there are all the food-like waste and food losses and all this. But more importantly, then we look on that, the plastics in food sector, packaging, huge. When we look on the transportation, even the rubbers like microplastics are huge. If we look on the greenhouse gas emissions related from the food production to the food loss, rotten food, and so on, huge. So then the plastics impact on the marine environment. The plastics like those packaging and all this in the storm drains and so on, the urban flooding and so forth. So the life on the land is huge. Again, the zero hunger, when we are talking, and if we relate this to the food waste and food loss, is again a huge. Then the poverty, as we already discussed. So even the jobs like goal 8 and so decent work and so on in the food sector. So the whole point is that how we really relate this only one like a 12.3 indicator or the food sector to relate to all the other indicators within that, like green public procurement. There's a huge public procurement in the food sector for many governments, for example. And then sustainable lifestyles again in that. And also the resource efficiency in terms of water required to produce the food, for example. So if we relate all this in making just food as the center, you can get that how we can really integrate all the SDGs, because there's a silos approach yet, unfortunately. So we have to break the silos and connect all the indicators, all the SDGs. I gave you example of food sector. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you very much for this. So I don't see any further question in the chat. So let us, there's a question over there. Thank you.
I just a reaction to the most of the presentations that that was presented now in this panel, and a lot of it seems to be on the getting really good data on making the reporting for VNRs and for progress on the indicators. And I was just wondering, I was working with the Natural Capital Coalition, and perhaps this would be something that the UN and governments could take a page from, and it's about the private sectors. And the way that we wanted to do the reporting was that we wanted to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. And if people are not using the same terminologies and the same reporting style, then we could not compare. And so what we did was we worked with the International Association of Chartered Accountants to make sure that when the corporations were making their profit and loss statements, that there was a there was a reporting on the use of natural capital, and it was very precise so that people could really see the use and comparing it apples to apples. So probably for this part, perhaps a more robust reporting mechanism so that everybody who are reporting and helping those who are reporting get to that standard so that there is a meaningful reading of the data.
Thank you very much. Yes, it goes back to having the right data in place. With this, let us wrap up. I mean, obviously, we had discussed such a diverse set of goals this morning. So I won't go into detail on any of the goals, but I think what the session clearly brought out was that COVID is impacting progress on all of the goals. And I think some of the impacts are still unknown. Some of the impacts are unknown because we didn't have the data in the first place. In other cases, we just haven't had the opportunity yet to collect data. But anyway, some indicative information is available around the reversal of earlier development gains, I think especially in relation to poverty, in relation to inequality, in relation to malnutrition, hunger, working hours, education, incomes. That was brought out very clearly. There were also, I think, a couple of, maybe we could even frame it as opportunities that COVID is bringing out, although it's of course difficult to frame COVID overall as an opportunity. But I do think that some of the key leverage points that the 5 speakers commented on around the importance of universal social protection, that is really coming back to the forefront of governments. And already we see many governments in the region acting on this to really reduce the negative social impact of COVID-19. The importance of thinking carefully about the informal sector and how that could be turned into more formalized approaches, whether in agriculture in rural areas or for small and medium scale enterprises in other sectors, I think is a big question, and we're beginning to think around that. Very clearly issues around digital innovation and technology and how to overcome this digital divide that we see reinforcing so many of the inequalities due to COVID is so much at the forefront of the discussion these days. I think all of the 5 speakers had discussed the need for better data and statistics, more data, better data, using the data in a better way, looking not only at quantitative data, but also having better qualitative data and better opportunities in place to use them, and focusing really on the most vulnerable. We need more information on the most vulnerable in all aspects of life. And that links me to the big issue around participation and engagement, that we require consultation in policy processes, which, however, then this goes back to the data issue, they really need to be informed by evidence. And of course, on this latter aspect, data and statistics and participation and having consultations in place, the voluntary national reports are already kind of leading the way in this region. Our countries in our region have a lot of experience now with voluntary national reports. We have many countries who are going into their 2nd report, some even going into the 3rd report. And in a way, this is like a playing field, a testing field for really getting a better sense of what is working and what is not working and where the gaps continue to be. So with this, let me thank all speakers. Let me thank our participants who stayed with us deep into the lunch break, and stay safe. And with this, let me hand over back to our moderator, Ronnie.
Okay, thank you very much, Katinka. So that concludes session 4 for this morning or afternoon. We will adjourn and reconvene back here at 1400 hours for the next session on the social cultural aspects of a Southeast Asian recovery framework. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronnie and Katinka.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks.
There's also a request to everyone to please complete the survey that has just been distributed by the Secretariat in the chat box. Thank you.